Is it connecting to the right one? Is it connecting to the right one, please? Yes, it is! Hallelujah! Sorry, for some reason YouTube decided to connect to the wrong one. Ah, joy of joys. Howdy. And check that shows up in the right... It does, it shows up in the right chat with the right people. Hello everyone, Restream is once again giving me a small panic attack, but nothing too major. Nothing that's going to cause too many issues. Just, you know, drop a couple of months off my life. Hello everyone, how are we all doing? Let me just check all the content. All the things are working. Ay, caramba. How to give me a bad time. Delete forever. Hey, bye, Legum. Hello, everyone. How are we all doing? I hope you're well. I hope you're enjoying life. I hope this is all working as it's supposed to be. And, well, hello. Sorry it took a little bit of a while to set up and get going, but, you know, for some reason, Restream decided it really didn't want to be helpful this evening, and I don't know why, but it did. It decided it didn't want to be helpful. Do you want to know why, Big Fluff? No. This is a very happy poodle today, I should point out. He didn't have to have a surgery. His ears almost reached the point at which they might need surgery, but he escaped this morning and no surgery. Hopefully he continues on the mend, don't you? But that is making you rather happy and a bit bunctious. But no. Go down and behave. Good boy. So, hello everyone, and welcome to Could Seaplane Tenders and their aircraft being put to great use in the Battle of Atlantic for better ASW coverage. And it's an interesting one to get into, it's an interesting point to discuss. And so, I've been looking forward to this patron suggestion. So, thank you, Andrew, who suggested it. I hope you're going to look forward to it, and I hope you're here to enjoy it. I didn't get the time wrong. Time was supposed to be 7:30. It's always 7:30. Was it scheduled for something different than 7:30? Because they're all supposed to be scheduled for 7:30. If there are ones which are not scheduled for 7:30, tell me about it and I'll make sure they're scheduled for 7:30. But they're supposed to be scheduled for 7:30 because that means I have time to deal with the issues before they get live. It was displaying 13:45. I have no idea why. I will now quickly check all my other scheduled ones for their 7:30. $7:30. 7:30 and 7:30, yes. So I have no idea why this one was scheduled for 6:45. I do apologise, because I just did the maths in my head. I hope that equates to 6:45. But I do apologise. $18:45. Yeah. 24-hour clock. Well, yes, I know, but honestly, Stephen, we can't alternate between the two. Most people can do the maths in their heads to do both. I think, just about. You've been there since 18:45 or 6:45 or whatever. I do apologise. I was bad. Normal time 7:30. Down. Good boy. I know, because of your time in the vets, you didn't get some of the things you normally like to do in a day, but you still not got an excuse for that. Now, the Patreon premiere, last January Patreon premiere, should be out this coming Wednesday. I'm sorry it's been delayed. But you see, there is a reason I leave them on the list. It's basically, until they're done, they're left up there. So it will be coming. And you might notice that what I have done with the September-October specials is because there were 2 which also got 9, and there were basically 4 which, there were roughly 4 videos which got 9 votes, and technically, therefore, 3 and 4 were shared between 4, 5, and 6 were all the same number. So what I did was I added them to the September-October specials for when I'm away, hopefully in Japan. So yeah, it's fun. Leaving that to one side, could seaplane tenders have been, and their aircraft have been put to greater use in the Battle of the Atlantic for better ASW coverage? Well, that's an interesting question. It is. It's also a question which is going to have a slightly different approach than I normally do with these things. Because basically, this is not an alternate history question. Okay? But it's a good case study for why we actually do alternate history when we're doing war studies. Why we do an alternate history. And sometimes, as historians, as war studies academics, why would we do an alternate history? Why we would examine it? Because we're looking at the reasoning of, okay, so what was the playoff? What were they getting instead of this? And trying to figure out what was the assessment made and why. Because that can often tell us what isn't written down. Because the annoying thing about history is how much isn't written down. Sometimes it can tell you where to go look for what is written down as well, if you do an alternate history properly, which is why I'm as strict as I am and why I tend to talk the way I do when I do them. But it starts off, it's definitely not alternate history. It's going to be basically normal, non-alternate history as it was, up until the Seamus book plug, then the Seamus book plug, and then there's going to be a bit of alternate history discussion. So first of all, we have to consider the pre-war bases. This is what's available in the Battle Atlantic scenario. Now, the thing is, the Royal Navy has a lot of bases. They have a lot of aviation facilities. They have Canada. They have the UK. So they have, theoretically, a lot of support. Plus, there's the pre-war scenario that the Royal Air Force, whether the Fleet Air Arm or Coastal Command, neither of which are completely part of the Navy or at all part of the Navy. Coastal Command works with the Navy on occasion. Upon very rare occasion, the Navy gets to work with Coastal Command. Because of the strictures that are set up. Now, I have to say, that's the official line. Unofficially, Coastal Command, quite a lot of the people involved in it, do their best to carry out joint exercises on an ad hoc, impromptu nature with the Navy whenever they can. But because you don't have anything so much as a formalised program or formalised system, it's very hard to actually have a worked-through command and control system prior to the war. Now, the thing is, when you have that as a scenario, this all becomes even more complicated. Because, okay, so the Air Service technically isn't working with the Navy. And the Navy has operational control of the Fleet Air Arm, which makes Fleet Air Arm units even more useful. Anything that's based off a ship is a Fleet Air Arm unit. So suddenly, if you're thinking about it in a way, the Royal Navy, if they'd had a large number of seaplane tenders and been able to operate them, they would have been under their command as part of the Fleet Air Arm, rather than Coastal Command. Okay. Because they'd have operated from naval ships. And the Royal Navy would have had operational control of them, which would allow them to work with them. Now, the thing is, you also have to start considering the realities of war as it was planned, as it was thought to be. Okay? One of the things that's often forgotten by many, even I would say historians sometimes, who are watching the decision-making of the process of the 1920s and 30s, is that Germany in the 1920s and for most of the beginning of the 1930s was not a threat on any stretch of the imagination. Germany was not a threat at that point. The Treaty of Versailles had annihilated their ability to make naval warfare. It stopped them having an air force, stopped them having submarines, stopped them having all sorts of things. The Treaty of Versailles. Okay? So one of the issues you deal with in the 1920s and 30s is that the war planning deals with the people that are threats. Who are the threats? Japan, Italy. So whilst they have those bases, etc., and whilst you have those as options, they are not the real issue here. What is the issue is, what would you be building to defend against who? If you're defending against Japan, well, sadly, let's look at the trade. Look at all those trade lines where the trade goes for Britain and the Maritime Empire. Look at how little goes into the South China Sea, let alone into the East China Sea, let alone into the Pacific from this direction. So as far as Britain's concerned, in a war against Japan, if you want to protect trade, and seaplane tenders, all these assets would be trade protection assets, wouldn't they? Well, Japan's kind of not a problem. You block off, you reinforce Singapore with a fleet, you're blocking them off at Singapore. You maybe put some forces in the Falklands and Caribbean just in case the Americans allowed them through the Panama Canal, and goodness gracious me, they tried to go south through the Pacific, make it round into the South Atlantic, and end up facing whatever's at the Falklands. That's what you do, but you don't really have to worry much because there isn't a lot of trade which is in their area of they can get at. And there are multiple points which will block it off. Yes, they might be able to get submarines in the Indian Ocean, so you'll need some defences there. But then most of the trade is going around India, or it's going up to the Red Sea. And again, you have those bases. You have already facilities that you can marshal there. Remember, the Royal Air Force tried to do the entire suppression of revolt and management of Iraq from the air. They tried to do all sorts of things. There are air bases, not particularly well located or well maintained air bases, but there are bases in this area. So, yeah, making that case for the war against Japan, who's the most likely threat, that's gonna be difficult. But it's not just Japan that's a problem, is it? See, the other potential problem in that period is the Italians. And, well, here's the problem for that. Look at all the trade which flows through the Mediterranean. And imagine all that trade having to go round Africa instead. And surface raiders make a right picking for that scenario, and the Italians, unlike the Japanese, have a lot of interesting connections, including East African bases and all sorts of issues going on. Connections all over South America. So the Italians are connected. The Italians are connected. And if they're connected, that's a problem. And then again, when you start thinking about the Japanese, what about them and surface raiders? If they can get a merchant ship into the Indian Ocean, into that area, that's going to cause trouble. So how do you defend this all? And more importantly, how do you sustain naval aviation operations around the world? What do you do with them? What do you have for them? That's the question today. Honestly, seaplane tenders, like other vessels, are all about sustainment of operations. They're all about what you need to sustain operations, whether that's trade protection or actual combat fleet operations. It's all about building infrastructure. You see, if I want to defend all these trade routes with aviation assets, I've got two choices. I build a load of air bases, which means they operate from fixed point to shore, but I'm going to need a lot of them. Or build aircraft carriers, which are going to be more expensive. Seaplane tenders are a kind of a halfway point because they're not mobile, they're not mobile in terms of their operations, like an aircraft carrier, but they are strategically mobile. I can redeploy them from area to area, unlike an airbase. But they're also not as large as an airbase. So let's consider the questions. And by the way, the questions, if you want them, I know when I'm doing brew ships, I tend to have the questions up on the screen. I'm going to carry on keeping doing that. But I can't really do that and have the slide of decent size in these videos. So what I tell you to do, if you want to see the chat and want to see what I'm answering, at this point I'm just about to answer Seneca Nero's question. Then at various points in the screen, you should be able to have the chat available to view. Usually there's a comment button if this is on a replay, and you can actually, that might also gives you a thing to click on the chat, and you'll be able to see the chat as it was playing live. There's also, if you're on a computer, you can have it up on the screen, and you can have the chat displayed on the right hand side or the left hand side. I think I did see someone who managed to have it mirrored round, but I'm not sure how they exactly did that. So there are options. I do know some people have been asking because they'd like to see the chat, and yeah, the reason I'm not displaying the chat is because of the space it would take up on the screen. So, would the Japanese fleet succeed in facing the South Atlantic? Lord help them. Okay, Lord help them. They had the issues they had in the Pacific. The South Atlantic is a whole different kettle of icy water, and it's not one I would really want to face if I was them. It really isn't. So, let's consider the operational requirements of a seaplane tender. Now, here is HMS Pegasus, formerly HMS Ark Royal, and her submarine Walrus. She operated those throughout World War II. She'd started off prior to World War I being the world's first purpose-built aircraft vessel. Purpose-built. As you can see, she's got cranes for launching and recovering them, plus a catapult. She's got hangar spaces for a few aircraft to be stowed, and accommodations, and honestly, she looks exactly like you'd imagine her to be. Now, is my mic volume pretty low? It's not supposed to be, but we'll see. Don't know why it would be low. I haven't been playing around with it at all, or changing it, so, yeah. We'll hope that makes things better. See. So, yeah. So, with the operational requirements of a seaplane tender, what are they? Well, for starters, they need to have maintenance space aboard, but not necessarily storage for all the aircraft they are operating, because if you're operating in a suitable harbour, you might have a space the aircraft can pull in, which they can just sit in the water. If it's suitably fresh water, suitable mix, it's not going to do them any damage. Or alternatively, you could maybe have them pulled up on the shore. You need space to maintain them. You don't necessarily need space to operate them. They can also take off and land on the water if you have suitable space, but if you have a catapult aboard, that tends to be quicker for launching them. Always good. You'll need cranes for recovering them. But yeah, they're honestly, do they need to be fast? Well, they're not keeping up the fleet. They need to be able to get to places and operate. They need to have space, lots of space, for machine shops, for accommodation, for stores. They have lots of operate options. Now, at the point we're going to be talking about early in the war, she operated supermarine walruses. So, Knight, it really doesn't matter what you're saying on this front. You're just honestly blasting away as normal. But she operated walruses. In fact, if I remember correctly, it was the Albatross which got the American planes, not the Pegasus. But we'll check. We will check. No. She had Fairy Fulmars at one point. She had Supermarine Walrus, Fairy Swordfish, and Fairy Sea Fox. At no point did she operate American aircraft, so I think, Knight, once again, you're confusing her with the Australian aircraft seaplane carrier, which we were talking about at the end. Now, Gary, answer the question. Who is the best person you have spoken to or chatted to about Royal Navy dreadnought designs up to World War II? Oh, most fun has been chatting with Drac. But there again, he and I were having the conversation on top of a roof, which we were repairing. So that adds a little frisson to the discussion when you are literally astride a shed roof, fixing shingles, making sure the roof is sound, and debating dreadnought design. We'll leave that to one side. So, what also requires seaplane tenders are required? Probably to carry them out of fuel, but again, one of the interesting things about them is because they tend to operate from harbours, from facilities you can readily get supply ships into, they're really easy to resupply. You don't need to send a fleet auxiliary, you can send any ship to resupply them pretty much, because they just have to sit next to them, hit up a pumping unit, pump fuel into them. They've got their own cranes aboard. If they need to lift heavy goods, well, they can lift aircraft. So anything that's supply-based, they can get aboard them themselves. And yeah, they carry a good mixture of aircraft. One of the things you find about the Fleet Air is they can all take variations on floats for quite a few of the aircraft. It's quite worrying at certain points, but you know, they try that. They do their best. It's also one of the reasons why the Royal Navy has the approach it does to speed. Because all its aircraft are supposed to be able to be float plane possible. And there's a reason for this, right? Because for quite a long time, a core part of the Royal Navy's strength is carried aboard their battleships and cruisers. Fighters, scout aircraft, a lot. They need to be able to recover them. Gives you a really interesting point of view is, what happens if the Royal Navy gets the Sea Gladiator with the floats it was considering prior to World War II, still has them in service, and HMS Repulse and HMS Prince of Wales are each packing to when they're in Force Z? Does having Sea Gladiators with floats help them in any way, shape or form? The answer is potentially, but potentially not. But it might buy time for the Buffaloes to arrive. Now, can a seaplane tender make it across the Atlantic? Yes, they can make it across the Atlantic. They can. Nicest way, these ships are built to go through rough weather, but also they're not. They're going to be able to pick their time. You go in case of right then. We want you to turn up here. Will they go through at fleet speed? No. They'll go through at a moderate. They're basically a merchant hull. So it's basically a merchant ship hull which has been orientated around the roll. But here is the big problem for seaplane tenders. Okay? As I've said, they operate from harbours mostly. They operate from bays. They operate from protected areas of water. This is the North Atlantic. I have put little flags of I want to go on both the major islands in there, other than Greenland and Iceland, so you could see them, because they're that tiny. You have the Azores, which is here. Portugal. Very useful, but owned by Portugal. Someone actually has to remember the old alliance to make use of it. If we could change that one to earlier, that would be helpful. We have Bermuda, which is Britain. Useful. We have the Faroes up here, which are Denmark. We have Greenland, which is Denmark. We have Iceland, which is Denmark. So pretty much, for the reality is, in the Battle Atlantic period, the Royal Navy has 2 seaplane tenders, and they don't really have anywhere to deploy them to and use them. You could say, well, if you have aircraft oriented on them before you've built the air bases, you can quickly rush these tenders over there. They can operate aircraft while you're building the air bases to bring the things online. But honestly, the tenders we're talking about, the Albatross and the Pegasus, who are the only 2 seaplane tenders in service with the Royal Navies, and please notice I'm saying Royal Navies here because it's HMAS Albatross. It was actually HMAS Pegasus for a while, and well, HMAS Ark Royal for a while, then Pegasus, when it went to the Australians, and that was just confusing, okay? It goes backwards and forwards. But the point is, they only have 2. Can they do a lot for the Battle Atlantic? Not really. The other problem you have is that the Walrus, which is probably the better of the 2 options for a float plane to operate from on a float plane configuration, realistically, with extra fuel tanks, etc., you're talking a patrol radius of 600 miles. 600 miles. Realistically, with all the fuel tanks in full reconnaissance configuration, that's what you're talking about, with ASW system, light ASW weapons fit and everything. And that's also with a slight modification, but that wasn't a modification which was unknown. That was a modification which was done on some of the aircraft, so we'll leave that to one side. The thing is, Swordfish takes it down less than that, unless you're dropping, well, if you drop the torpedo and add in the extended range fuel tank, then that does increase things, but floats add enough drag that doesn't. It's always complicated because the Swordfish is a float plane configuration, the Walrus is a seaplane, and the aerodynamic capabilities of a float plane versus a seaplane are different. So, with that being said, and all things being considered, and, you know, 600 miles would cover the entire island of Ireland, yeah. There are some advantages. There's not really much they can do. So, short answer is not really. With all that discussion, the whole point of the seaplane tenders is, can they do much for the Battle Atlantic? As you only had 2, and with the aircraft available, the answer is Not really. There isn't really an option. However, you see, life isn't that good or that simple often, and it rarely is often that simple, because you see, whilst I can say this, that's not the question. And that would have been a very quick presentation. The question, which was asked, which I remembered, was, could seaplane tenders and their aircraft having put to greater use in the Battle Atlantic for better ASW coverage? And the answer is yes, they could have been, if there actually had been some seaplane tenders to go around. If there'd actually been some seaplane tenders to go around. Enough of them. You see, one of the problems with only having two, and having quite small ones, and not having therefore invested enough in the technology, is even if you get things like the PBY Catalina coming into service with the Royal Air Force, you can't really sustain and support them. You don't have the tender fleet the US Navy has. And the thing is, if you'd had this as a plan prior to the war, if you'd started building them and procuring them earlier, and you hadn't presumed that even when Germany became a power, when it started getting stronger again, oh, you could block it off in the North Sea like you did in World War I, because Norway won't fall, and France won't fall. If you hadn't done that, if you'd gone, well, I might need something for secondary and tertiary theatres, and I might need some agreements with Denmark, let's say, for basing rights. These things could all have been worked out prior to the war, because it's one thing to say, okay, we're neutral, we're not allowing you to base us here. But it's another thing to say, well, you know what, if one of your ships happens to be operating out of this bay, a seaplane tender, we're going to ignore it. Because it's not ashore, we're not sustaining or supporting it, it's not setting foot on our territory, it's just operating from a bay, and who knows, we might not know it's there. What was the war like in heavy weather? It was fun to fly in all weathers. But realistically, there aren't many options for the North Atlantic. There are not many options for where to base it. But again, even then, if there are options which make things more viable, you see, it's not a dead end. Like HMS Unicorn and her planned sister HMS Ocean, I know Knight has put his own idea of what the successor would have been, but no, it wasn't going to be Pegasus. It wasn't. That was not on the list of likely scenarios. It just wasn't. The USS Pegasus herself, had only been sort of commissioned as that in 1934. She had all sorts of duties, she had all sorts of service with the Royal Navy, and the fact is she was useful as that. She was useful in that role, and she was being kept in the role. Often Pegasus has been used for interesting ships in the Royal Navy. Now, the mobile naval air basing and mobile naval basing and mobile base defense organization, all the other systems that the Royal Navy stands up and is starting to develop in the 1930s, is because of the infrastructure challenge they face. It's because of the realities of protecting a rather large empire. It's because of the problems Britain has in fighting its primary war threat. And its primary war threat, if we go back to it and go back to this earlier discussion, is Japan over here. And their major industrial hub is here. And if you want any big proof of that, have a look at this. These are the major sea lines of the empire. Where is the major industrial hub in this empire? And please note, the Royal Navy doesn't give a flying hoot about where it is politically. They want to know because they want to know which trade they have to protect to keep the empire going. Okay? That's what they care about. They have trade routes on here which are between Europe and America and never touch the British Isles. They don't care on this map. They are hunting for where is the major trade concentration going to. And this is Dominion shipping. British and Dominion merchant shipping. So this is where their trade is going. If it's going between two countries, they want to know. If it's going with different ways, they want to know. They want to know where it is and what it's doing. We have mentioned the Azores, Garrus, the Brit. We haven't got into it yet in final detail. Knight, please note, HMS Pegasus hadn't gone by World War II because we've just said she was serving in World War II. So I realise you have views, but I find it really slightly problematic when you put actual wrong history in the chat while I'm talking it through. Because that's actually blatantly wrong history. And I don't want to get into this with you now. Save the discussion for the end, and I will happily have it with you then. Okay? But the thing is, if you put the comments in the chat and I don't deal with them, then they can start other people going off down the wrong route and not knowing stuff. And if it's like if I have a student in class who's saying those sort of things, I would go, calm down, stop, that's not quite right, we'll discuss at the end. And I'll do it the same with you now. We'll discuss it at the end. Okay? I always make time at the end for questions. Thanks, Derek. So the thing is, with Japan as the primary threat, they've had to work out how to protect this trade, but also how to project their power. All the infrastructure is based back in the UK, so they have to support and sustain things over there. Which is why they have the mobile naval bases. And the idea is this, with the mobile bases. You set up a base in an island, in a port which you previously didn't necessarily control, and you haven't set up any infrastructure in. You go in, you have all the infrastructure with you, you set it up. The idea at this point is to charter merchant ships, load them up with goods, turn up and take them over. And then once you've set up the infrastructure there, then this ship runs between those bases and the carriers, carrying spare aircraft, or maybe repairing aircraft while it's with the carriers, etc. And all sorts of recycling and cycling aircraft through, and doing a lot of work itself on them. Okay? That's the purpose. It and its sister. Now, when you go into that, and you start looking through these options, this is what the Royal Navy's considering. This is what the Royal Navy's thinking about. You start to think about going, well, why is Pegasus kept around? She's kept around on an experimental basis. And one of the things she does on an experimental basis is, guess what she's used to do when they do an exercise? She's used to be part of that port facility. She turns up with the aviation components, helps them setting up the aviation stuff for support, helps them supporting seaplanes, helps them with all those things. And suddenly it makes a lot of sense. And the thing is, when you look at the Monad Doctrine, realistically, the Royal Navy should have had some more seaplane tenders. They really should have done. Because the whole idea for defence of global trade and defence of their economics, these are secondary and tertiary theatres, yes, but they are critical economic. They're a critical economic part of the wider empire. They're a critical part of the force structure and the overall capability. So you need to be able to defend them. And one of the problems you have consistently throughout history, and anyone who's ever been involved in advising government, but also in advising companies, will tell you this, is trying to explain the value of insurance. You see, here's the thing. If I'm a politician or anyone reading this at this period in the 1920s and 1930s and looking at this, and I know that my major threats are Italy and Japan, and I can have them sealed off, why do I need to spend any money on defending this area? Why do I need to spend any money on defending on this area? Well, the argument goes, those are secondary and tertiary theatres, yes. Those are going to be other economic, those are going to be theatres which are going to be different. But in the nicest way, if you lose the Mediterranean because of Italy, and you have to fight the war there, you've got all the trade going around, you're going to be incredibly exposed. There's going to be a lot of trade going a long way, and you've got nothing to support it, nothing to protect it. And if you've got nothing to support it and nothing to protect it, you're in trouble, because if something does turn up there, you have to withdraw that from your war-fighting capability. This is the classic scenario we face a lot with the modern navies. Okay? A lot of modern defence procurement, a lot of modern structuring, has been based about procuring the assets you need to fight the primary theatre. And that's great. But that means if anything turns up in a secondary or tertiary theatre that you actually have to go deal with, for political or economic reasons, even though it's not a major military threat, you have to go deal with it, you then have to withdraw assets from the primary theatre. Why do you have HMS Courageous out with HMS Ark Royal hunting submarines? Because they don't have any seaplane tenders and they don't have any escort carriers or smaller carriers to go doing the job. So they have to have full-size fleet carriers doing it. It's not a new scenario we find ourselves in today. It's not a new scenario in this time period. Because if I'm a politician, maybe I have the view I want to raise less tax. I want lower taxes. So I don't want to spend that money. Or maybe I want to spend that money on something else. Maybe I want to spend it on a giant fountain, which is going to honour my favourite goddess. Maybe I want to spend it on, I don't know, a school. It's a great thing to spend it on. It's a guaranteed thing to spend it on. But the thing is, I only have so much money. And this is making me talk about insurance, not for a primary theatre of war, a theatre which I think I can seal off, because if the Royal Navy's strong enough in Singapore, how will Japan get into the Indian Ocean or the Atlantic? How will they get a surface raider into there? A large merchant ship would never switch round, would it? Yeah, of course it would. No, the fluffy research assistant has not gone anywhere. He's asleep down there. And he's not even waking up when he's being called. And, you know, if I'm fighting the Italians, well, I can block them off at the Suez, at Gibraltar. Why? Why? No, I'm not buying a giant fountain for my new house, Garrus. No, no, no. The moment I'm still getting the gate fixed. You know, the thing is, if you're going to be doing these things, you don't need these assets, because they're going to be locked into a primary theatre, and so that's not all you need to worry about. Now, admittedly, with the case of the Italians, you can point out and go, well, they have forces in East Africa. They're already out of their Mediterranean curtain. They can already operate beyond there. So surely they matter. And of course they should do. And then you have the added rise of Germany. And even that doesn't change the argument, because then it's a case of, well, we just do the same we did to them in World War I. We blockade them into the North Sea. How? Distant blockade. And of course, no one thinks Norway's going to fall. No one thinks France is going to fall. So all this makes sense. All this is rationalised on perfectly logical things. but it means you have no insurance for if things go wrong. They have no backup. It becomes comical once you realise how easy it would have been to have some backup. Because you see, the London Naval Treaty actually gives us some options. It really does. London Naval Treaty has a lot of options and a lot of capabilities in it. Because it has Part 2, Article 8. Now, I often am quoting I'm often quoting B. But today I'm going to be quoting sections C, D, and E. Naval services vessels, this is C, not specifically built as fighting ships, which are employed on fleet duties, or as troop transports, or in some other way as fighting ships, provided they have none of the following characteristics. Mount a gun above 6.1 inches. Okay. Mount more than 4 guns above 3 inches. Are designed or fitted to launch torpedoes. Are designed for a speed greater than 20 knots. Heard that before. Are protected by armour plate. Are designed or fitted to launch mines. Are fitted to receive aircraft on board from the air. Please note that. Are fitted to receive aircraft on board from the air. These are ships which are allowed to be built which are exempt from limitation. In fact, these are exempt from any limitation. Number D. Mount more than 1 aircraft launching apparatus on the centre line, or 2 on 1 on each broadside. Okay, so I'm allowed maximum 2 catapults. Good to know. You can probably make do with 1 large one, centre line that I can point round. If fitted with any means of launching aircraft into the air, are designed or adapted to operate at sea more than 3 aircraft. Okay. And one of the other fun things is that in Annex I, Rules for Replacement, there's also Section 4, Vessels Retained for Experimental Purposes. D. The United Kingdom is allowed to retain, in their present conditions, the monitor Roberts, the main armament guns and mountings of which have been mutilated, and the seaplane carrier Ark Royal, until no longer required for experimental purposes. The retention of these 2 vessels is without prejudice to the retention of the vessel permitted under C above. Now please note, Section C is what is originally used to allow for the building of Unicorn. Ah, yes. They said launching is fine. You're not allowed to receive aircraft from the air. So as long as aircraft cannot land on it, they can take off from it. So cranes are fine. And as long as it can't operate more than 3 aircraft at sea. The thing is, though, you could have the aircraft could fly to their destination if you're taking the supplies with them, or with the ship, or you could just have 3 which are able to be held in normal configuration. The other 3 could be box configuration, which the Royal Navy does anyway with their spare aircraft. The US Navy likes to store their spare aircraft semi-complete, dangling from the hangar ceiling, or rather the flight deck. The Royal Navy, well, the gantry, the framing supporting the flight deck. Well, the Royal Navy tends to have them boxed in box condition below. So yeah. It's a fun thing to think about, because this means that what we're talking about is actually a fairly possible scenario. And yes, this is a Fairy Swordfish in float plane condition being launched from HMS Malaya. Yes, it wasn't just Warspite which carried the Fairy Swordfish. And if you can get such vessels going, well, while 600 nautical miles is not a lot, you turn up with, let's say, 3 aircraft in flying condition and a further 9 boxed that you quickly deploy, and you start operating 12 aircraft, and yeah, you have fairly good coverage going on. You have fairly good coverage going on. And the Pegasus is explicitly let. So there's a precedent of the Pegasus herself, and there is the entire system. Now, one of the problems I will say is if you start pushing this, there are issues for maybe HMS Unicorn herself. But not realistically if you tie it into these are the vessels which are for the bases. You see, here is some of the ships which carried a specialist gear for setting up those naval air bases. They'll set up the sea base side, the seaplane side, and supporting the float planes in the harbour, and also carry the equipment ashore, equipment that will be deployed ashore, probably by the lighter they'll carry, like HMS Unicorn herself has, the vessel which she uses, the little sort of thing she drops down to get aircraft, receive aircraft, and put aircraft back aboard aircraft carriers, etc. She has them running around. They have options there. They could have their own lighter, and they could actually get their own equipment ashore. They could get a bulldozer ashore, which could help build a runway. They could be carrying they could carry matting that could help them preform the runway or preform the beach, etc. There's all sorts of things you can put onto such a vessel. And if you want to know who does do such a vessel, well, you see, there's this other navy called the US Navy at this time. And unlike the Fleet Air Arm, unlike the Royal Navy, they actually have control of their example of Coastal Command. They actually have their own search aircraft, their own long-range maritime patrol aircraft. And this is a major part of their war plan, are actually seaplane tenders. Things like the Barnegat class, which is 2,040 tons in standard. Some 5-inch guns on there. And it's rather cute. And it's got a space aft for it to be able to lift the seaplane up and maintain it and check it if it needs to. But mainly it's carrying stores, it's carrying fuel, it's carrying the systems to maintain and support them. Now this vessel is pretty darn cool to me. It's pretty darn capable as well. But what it also is something the US Navy built a lot of, because it makes sense for the Pacific, for their kind of operations. It makes sense because you literally turn up to an island, you put minimal facilities ashore on the island, and you have aviation support established. And from there, you can put accommodation. You can set up some temporary accommodation blocks ashore. You can set up some temporary aircraft parking, etc. But all the major maintenance facilities, all the machine shops, all the things you need to be really high intensity and need to be really well maintained and really well built, they're all built at home in the shipyard on the ship. And guess what happens when you need to move that airbase? Well, you move the ship. Let's be honest. Accommodation blocks, all those things, they're rather easy to set up. Especially when this has all your medical facilities aboard as well. So it has your hospital, has your administration, it has all your staff rooms, all the facilities you need for running the operations. You can just do that. This is a mobile naval airbase. Literally, this is what it is. It just doesn't carry any aircraft at all. I'm saying that for the Royal Navy, being able to carry a few would be quite useful. Now, the thing is, we are talking about float planes as they existed when we talk about historically, and when they're using it historically, and that's one of the things worthwhile considering. But there's also the fact that if you do have this as a program starting off earlier on in the 1930s, if let's say, well, the earliest time they start mooting these, and they do talk about seaplane tenders, is Admiral Henderson becoming Third Sea Lord in 1934. Well, he's Third Sea Lord in 1933, but 1934 they start talking about it. Then the reality is that you could start making this case far more. And if the Royal Navy did get a couple of dozen of these vessels in service, that's going to increase the size of the fleet air arm, but it's also going to increase the argument for having more fleet air, having the fleet air arm being a part of the Navy more. Because the larger the fleet air arm grows, and the larger the Royal Air Force grows, the more there is the case for them being separate organisations. One of the key arguments that have been made for the Fleet Air Arm being part of the Royal Air Force had always been that it was going to be such a small portion of the Navy in terms of its strength, but it was going to be such a large proportion of the total air strength of the armed forces that it could not afford for it to be separate from the Royal Air Force, because it would be a detriment to both the Air Service and to the Air Force and to the Fleet Air Arm. Well, once the Royal Air Force, A, starts to grow exponentially, and B, the Fleet Air Arm starts to grow as well, in the 1930s, you suddenly have a problem with this argument. And that's part of the reason why the Inskip Award takes place in 1937. But one of the reasons why they argue it said in 1937 and they delay it till 1939 that there's going to be full transition is because of the size of the Navy and the size of the Fleet Air Arm. If you're building these ships from 1934-35 onwards, that's going to increase the aviation assets available. And they're going to be quite quick and easy to build. To get out a dozen, 2 dozen. And if you have them in service, well, that's going to be useful. But that's also going to argue for all sorts of other options. You see, what happened with the USN was they started off looking at Kingfisher-like aircraft, and they end up with Catalina-like aircraft, because once you have them, you start wanting to make the best out of them, and you realise that, hang on, we don't have to be limited by the size of the aircraft you can take aboard. Now, what I could see the Royal Navy may be doing, if they're being particularly rude and inventive, and we're going to talk about all these options as we go around, is going for a mixture of aircraft. But I did say, when we reached the middle point, before we went into full alternate history and discussing the scenario that therefore does help us work out what some of the reasoning was and why they figured it out the way they did, we're going to have a shameless book plug. And so, without much further ado, the shameless book plug. So thank you everyone for supporting the channel. Thank you everyone for helping out. I'm going to also quickly answer some of the questions that have been created themselves. Always thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing. It really does help the channel grow. It really is important to the channel to growing, and I realise I've been having a little issue getting the videos out as promised lately, but that's hopefully going to be over soon. I'm starting to work to the point at which we're getting ahead. Believe it or not, Friday's video is not finished for tomorrow yet. But next Saturday's video is uploaded and ready to go, as is next Tuesday's video. That's the kind of weird situation I'm in, because I've been fussing over Friday's video because it's the Farragut one, and making sure I get it right and I'm happy with it. But we'll leave that to one side. That's me being obsessive and mildly crazy. Life happens that way. Now, in answer to the earlier question, Ocean was transferred. Basically, Ark Royal's second sister was supposed to be, if she had a sister, was going to probably be called Ocean. And then that name was transferred into the Unicorn construction by Henderson. Very much they didn't want to go for Pegasus. There's a reason why not to go for Pegasus. You have to remember, Pegasus had worked with the Royal Australian Navy, and Pegasus was kind of important to them on a political level. So the Royal Navy didn't want to use Pegasus for that, and they didn't want to rename it. Plus, they wanted to keep her around, because whilst they didn't have many seaplane tenders, they were useful for what they needed to do. And if you go and look at her career, you see what she spends most of her wartime doing. What she spends the vast majority of her World War II doing is being useful. She's aircraft transport, she is doing various options prior to the war with the home fleet, teaching people how to launch from a catapult and how to do various options. She's there to provide support for aircraft in Scarpa Flow. She's basically going around being a basing asset, and she's useful as that. There's a reason why she gets radars fitted, why she does all sorts of duties the way she does during World War II. She's useful in her role. And so they're keeping her around. They're not getting rid of her just yet. Knight, again, I'm not, I don't know what I'm not sure what you're trying to make the case of, but the only discussions I've seen for naming have been about the proposed second unicorn. They hadn't got on to whether there was going to be more unicorns, and it's not Pegasus, it's Ocean, as said, moved from Mark Roll. Pegasus was not there. They haven't even got to the point of even mooting a third unicorn. And there's a reason they hadn't got to the point of mooting a third unicorn, because, believe it or not, you don't need as many unicorns if you're building implacables. Why? Because implacables have 2 hangars and have enough space to do their own maintenance. So suddenly your need for a unicorn goes a lot down. You need unicorns to support illustriouses. And realistically, if you have illustrious, victorious, and their sisters, all 4 of them, do you need more than 2 unicorns to support them? You don't. Not even in the Far East. You don't. Once you're there's even an argument once you get onto the enhanced Indomitable over the illustrious class that you might not need the unicorn to do as much of that. So that's the issue. Unicorns make sense. They're very useful. But you don't need that many of them. The larger your fleet carriers are, and the more space they have to do maintenance themselves. Knight, all Royal Navy carriers were planned to carry seaplanes, and all of them did carry seaplanes because they were used as their pilot recovery assets. I do realise there are some who make more of that than others. But yeah, the search and rescue assets for the Royal Navy during World War II for most carriers were Supermarine Walruses, which were deployed as such. You will often find a couple of Supermarine Walruses sitting on a carrier as search and rescue. Writing competition video probably will come out probably end of February. Because it's just been delayed. The thing is, with plumbing and all the other stuff going on, all sorts of things have been delayed. So, and it's one of the interesting things when you start getting into it, is people go, well, why didn't they use helicopters? You don't have helicopters available at that point. They're not at that level of technology, so you're using these. And so there's a perfectly sensible reason they're being designed to facilitate operating seaplanes. The question is how many seaplanes they're going to operate and what they're going to be used for, because there's also the thing of, were they going to use them as long-range reconnaissance planes? Because if you use seaplanes for that, if they run out of fuel, they can ditch on the sea and their crews might survive. And someone else can go pick them up and maybe carry enough fuel to get them out. Or maybe they ditch near a destroyer and they survive. Whereas if you're using a land plane configuration aircraft, it's got no chance. They've got to bail. Oh, okay. Sorry if I missed this. Not watching right at the start. How navies imagine using seaplanes open ocean like in calm seas? They didn't. They really didn't. It was never considered a good idea to use them in open ocean after World War One. They'd done enough in World War One. They really didn't want to. But the thing is, as you could do with the Courageous Gloria scenario, the Courageous Ark Royal hunting submarine scenario, you could probably would have had the seaplane carrier supporting operations from shore near enough by to provide air support. Yeah, channel. The closest thing during World War II that was practical was an autogyro, and that wasn't something they were going to trust turned out. When helicopters come into service, that's when seaplanes really go out. Prior to that, though, there's a consideration. The thing is, what's the main use for the Battle Atlantic? Well, the Battle Atlantic becomes a primary theatre. You still have the South Atlantic, though, and the Indian Ocean, and the Far East. Your primary theatres for much of the war for Britain are the North Atlantic, the Arctic, and the Mediterranean. Now, if we consider how this comes about, it comes about because of Germany's growth in strength in the mid-1930s. Italy is still getting more and more belligerent, although always interesting. And Japan is the mercurial Japan. They are a nation at this time of great passion, of great fervour, and great commitment. All of which are excellent things. But it means if you go down the wrong path, you will go down it hard, fast, and without regard for what's warnings you're going to get along the way. Now, when we start looking into this, you start realizing that, well, if you can focus and support your efforts in the North Atlantic more by having less forces committed elsewhere to the war effort, or rather using those assets more efficiently, that makes things viable. That makes things better, easier, more straightforward. It's a tough one, working it through and thinking about it, but it's not exactly a hard choice to make. It's the insurance idea. So what could I use these for? Well, let's go back to this. I've got all this trade to protect. And if I'm going to set up modern bases and supply them to support air power to cover all of them, that's going to be hundreds of bases. Hundreds of bases. Hundreds of bases. That's not going to happen. In a nicest way, there's the classic example of the air bases they build in Malaya, which they don't have aircraft for. They were supposed to, but they didn't have them. And the classic example in this period is the fact that the RAF's war plan for Malaya had been the army to protect their air bases until their aircraft showed up. And the army going, why would we protect an empty airbase? Because it can be used by the enemy. Why do you build it then? So we could get our aircraft to it. But you don't have aircraft for it. No, but we will. When? A year or so. That doesn't make sense. It's like a lot of things during the Malaya campaign. There are a lot of decisions made by some very smart people who get into some very fine logic holes. In my experience, usually people who are at the highest end of the intelligence field and the lower ends of the intelligence field in terms of IQ, not necessarily EQ or CSQ, that's common sense quotient. People always like to talk about IQ, intelligence quotient, and EQ, emotional quotient. I add CSQ, i.e. common sense quotient. Okay. My experience, usually if you're at either end of those spectrums of the IQ or the EQ spectrums, your CSQ tends to suffer. But some people are good at CSQ who are at those ends. It's a variable. Anyway, if you're at the either end of the IQ spectrums, you tend to find yourself getting into, people in the middle can, but people at the ends will have more likelihood to get into what I call logic holes, where they think themselves into a hole. They literally decide, well, this A equals B, so B must equal C, and C must equal D, so I must do E, because of A equaling B. And at no point do they stop to ask themselves, A, does A equal B? And also, what are the actual relationships between these different things? You have followed this logic, you have decided. No point have you questioned your logic. One does it because they think they're so smart they don't believe they could get anything wrong. And the other one, usually because they haven't properly been taught to because of whatever reason they're not sort of at higher up in the IQ scale. They've been left by people not given the proper teaching on skills on how to question their thinking, which is usually down to, in my experience, is down to things beyond their control. And if you've got to protect all this, you've got to protect this trade. And you've got to also do the mobile naval basing. Suddenly, if you're not going to build those air bases, because I said that's expensive, your other option is to build a load of aircraft carriers, isn't it? To have them patrol down. But that's also going to be very, very expensive. Because you don't just have to build an aircraft carrier to build its escorts. You have to build the things that are going to protect it. Keep it supplied at sea, all the fleet auxiliaries, and all the other vessels to support it. So let's be honest, the advantage of a carrier versus an airbase is it moves, so it can cover more area in terms of supporting aircraft, because it moves. But an airbase is far cheaper to secure than an aircraft carrier, because honestly, in a world war, especially in this period, how many enemy forces can actually reach that airbase? If it's ashore and far enough inshore that no one can fire from a ship and easily see it. It's not got line of sight onto the sea. There is, however, a halfway point. It's a seaplane tender. It's not going to be operating at sea. It really isn't. It's going to be operating from a harbour, from a bay, which you can defend. It could even... Here is a little trick. You could set them up in pairs. You could have 2 dozen and have them operate in dozen pairs. Each one could support a squadron of aircraft. They could have some installed, boxed, and free out operational for when they get there, so they can get immediately into a service. And one of them can carry all the things to go ashore to build an airbase ashore, and the infrastructure ashore they need to build. And one of them could carry a whole load of defences which get offloaded and put ashore. Some 6-inch guns, perhaps. So you can have a shore battery set up and built. You've got the Royal Marines, and then that suddenly gives you, let's say, along the African coast, that suddenly gives you a base which has popped up, which wasn't there. They literally could be there, and within a couple of hours, they're operating aircraft from there, from arrival in the harbour. Within a week, they've got the defences set up, and they've got, well, even a couple of days, they've got the defences set up. Within a week, they've got the airfields set up ashore, and they're supplying and supporting everything. And suddenly you've got an airfield. Suddenly you've got a supply base. And all you need to do to supply it then, you don't. It's got its all defences built in. It's built in its defences. They've built out the facilities with them. All you need to supply it, get a merchant ship to it every now and again. And it offloads them. Now, the thing is, what does this do? Well, how does this help the Battle Atlantic? Well, if you're actually... Think about this. German submarines don't just attack in the North Atlantic. They go elsewhere. So do German surface raiders. So do a lot of the German assets. They don't just hit in the North Atlantic. They go further. They go further. They go all around the world. They go to the Graf Spee, goes into the Indian Ocean, all sorts of things. So if I have these vessels to set up, I can set them up in places like the Falkland Islands. I can set them up in places like South Africa, etc. And I can immediately start operating aircraft. Now, the trouble is going to be what aircraft I operate from. Realistically, I have 2 domestic aircraft to pick from if I'm going to be setting this up in the 1930s. They're Swordfish and Walrus. You can have the ferry Swordfish or the submarine Walrus. Now, here's the cute thing. If I go for the Walrus, A, that's better for landing and taking off and slightly range operations, but also, here's the really interesting thing. If I set up my ships around supporting and sustaining 12 of them once they're in operation, 3 while they're at sea, but 12 once they're in operation in harbour, there's probably going to be quite a bit of space left over. And if I'm sensible, I can maybe use it to support other and more aircraft. Because here's the thing. This will only come about, and if this did come about, it's a change in the approach. It's adding in some extra ships. Where's the funding going to come from? Honestly, they wouldn't be that expensive, but they wouldn't be too big a ship. We'd be talking... probably 2,500 to 3,000 tons. They would not be large vessels. They would really not be large vessels. But what they could do, once they've set up their facilities and offloaded their system, their things ashore, what they need to carry and what they need to support, they could also be used to support other aircraft. Now, the Swordfish has the advantage it can be used as a torpedo bomber. It can be used as a strike aircraft against surface assets. So maybe I do want those. But the Walrus is better at long-range reconnaissance. If I have a pair of carriers, a pair of these tenders operating together, I could have one take a squadron of Swordfish and one take a squadron of Walrus. And the Swordfish can do reconnaissance as well as torpedo strikes. So I've still got a fairly good reconnaissance asset, but it's not got quite the same range as the Walrus for it. And the thing is, if I really want to be clever, I can maybe add some Catalinas in as well. Because you see, this is the option you have. Once you have Seaplane Tenders up and running, and you know they're going to be available, even if they can't necessarily carry a Catalina or something that size themselves, you can support them. You can set up the facilities on board them so that they can support a Catalina when it's landed. That you can set up so those bases can be resupplied by short Sunderlands turning up and dropping off massive supplies. And that becomes particularly interesting. Now, you could make them slightly larger. You could go for 4,500 ton models that could support and sustain not just the aircraft ashore, all those things they need to drop off, but could also carry a boxed up squadron of Swordfish as well as Walrus. But it becomes more difficult. Remember, you've got to be not operating more than 3 aircraft when you're at sea. And you get too big, it kind of gets a bit obvious. But you can get around, you can do things, you can modify things, you can make things. Let's be honest. The people we're talking about are the people who managed to convince everyone that this was not an aircraft carrier. This is a forward aviation support vessel, not an aircraft carrier. Okay? There are also some people who are very committed to the idea that this has no connection at all to the light fleet carriers. Which always causes me to absolutely giggle, but we'll leave that to one side. They point out it's separate. They point out it's separate design codes and things, and I go, yes, but it's also a copy and paste. No, it just happened to be a copy and paste, and the frames actually line up. Oh well, that's just coincidence. No, the prop shafts, the frames, everything lines up. The whole design, and operation lines up. Yeah. That what's changed is some of the internal configuration, because they got rid of some of the machine shops and some of the other spaces this vessel has on it, which makes sense. It is a forward aviation support ship, not an aircraft carrier. So when we do talking about people like that, imagine what they can do if they're charged to build something which is like this, but also has the also carries a load of boxed aircraft, and has 3 or 4 operational, well, 3 operational. And a catapult. It'll be able to defend itself. It really will be able to. And so when we start talking about this scenario, if you've got the larger ones especially, the larger they are the better, the more likely you are for the Royal Navy, especially if they've got controls, to start acquiring Catalinas. Because, as people have already pointed out, even if you get Walrus building, these Supermarine building the Walrus as much as they can, and remember, Supermarine spent World War II building 2 aircraft types, the Spitfire and the Walrus. And whenever the Air Ministry tried to get them to stop building the Walrus, they were told no, they had to. So the Walrus was built. The thing is, if you're building the Walrus and you're building the Spitfire, the reason the Royal Navy doesn't get the Seafire that was originally conceived, rather than Seafire it later gets, which is a variant of the Spitfire, is because the Air Ministry going, no, they need to focus in on our capabilities. The reason the Royal Navy is the first service to go hunting in America for aircraft is because they're trying to get round the Air Ministry. It's their only way to get access to aircraft. So there is actually a goodly chance that if you have seaplane tenders already in commission, considering when the PBY Catalina enters service, the consolidated Catalina enters service in 1936 and enters production, etc. and service. If you're talking 1938 is now the conclusion of the Inskip Award rather than 1939 because of these ships, because of the added forces they add on, the added strength, the added purpose they add on, there is a good chance the Royal Navy orders PBY Catalinas in 1938. In which case, they're going to get them delivered toot sweet. They're going to have them before World War II begins. And that adds a whole new equation onto their reconnaissance capabilities. Because suddenly that gives the Royal Navy an independent long-range maritime patrol capability. That gives them something they can have sitting in off the coast of Africa, they can have sitting in the Falklands, giving them patrol access. And the reality is, if you have that, then the war starts to change. Because world wars are about resource allocations. They're marathons, not sprints. They're all about how you mitigate and how you manage your resources and allocate them and eke them out over time. It's about the accumulation of victories. And see, one of the interesting things when you're talking about a surface raider like the Graf Spee, which does famously go in the Indian Ocean and various other places, it's dodging around. But one of the reasons it's able to dodge around is because of the relative paucity of air search going on at the time. There isn't that much. Famously, the Bismarck is spotted by a Catalina. Famously, all sorts of later on war vessels are spotted by things. But the Graf Spee manages to get around it. The Graf Spey managed to dodge the Cumberland, managed to dodge all sorts of things because it was able to get around it. Some of the areas it goes to operate in, if you had such things as these seaplane tenders, guess what? They'd have been operating in those areas. Now, does that mean I think that the Graf Spey would wander into one of those areas and get sunk? No. Here's the thing, if I'm a surface raider and I know there's aircraft operating in that area, maybe I detect their radio signals, maybe I spot them at a distance, maybe I get an intelligence tip-off, it doesn't really matter. I know there's aircraft operating in that area. I'm going to keep away from it because there are easier pickings elsewhere. And one of the ways you can hunt an enemy is by knowing where it isn't. Knowing where it isn't. You see, if you have aircraft searching from the Falklands, if you have aircraft searching from Africa, from South Africa, from Freetown, etc., suddenly areas where the Graf Spey was pretty darn vicious and pretty darn successful become no-go areas. Suddenly, for a surface raider, even a vessel configured as a merchant ship, let alone something which is an actual full-blown warship, going in those areas becomes rather high risk. Because if you get spotted, then a cruiser can come and hunt you down. And if you're, let's say, a converted merchant ship, okay, maybe that cruiser hunting you down is a D-class or an E-class. Maybe it's an older vessel. But if you're something like the Graf Spey and you're spotted, well, something fun's going to come running your way. Possibly HMS Barham or HMS Renown going, "Hello, we hear you're here." HMS Repulse going, "Hello." And that's really a critical point. You could really put positions which are traditional, quite critical, important areas under a watch rapidly when war begins. You could have actually had seaplane tenders set up before the war begins. Would anyone put that past the Royal Navy? If they have these assets, they're able to deploy them. What is the betting they're in place they start putting them in place in August, July 1939. They start sending them out to where they would like to operate them in case of war with Germany. I have a scenario for it. They'll allocate them off. And the thing is, the moment they start their patrols, they're watching. What's going on? What are they seeing? What are they not seeing? And that starts building up your information picture. You don't have satellites to call on, but if you can position these ships, you can position those aircraft. Yeah. Jonathan Moon, the Seafire I was talking about earlier was the Gullwing Seafire, not the later Spitfire variant Seafire. There's a whole different thing. Well, it's the gull-winged aircraft which the submarine were working on at the same time as they asked for the name Seafire to be allocated to them. So that's where we get the idea it was the one named to Seafire from. And it was gull-winged because of the realization of its needs to land on a carrier deck, sort of thing. There's all sorts of codes. I've been through this one before, specifications, etc. for that. And so there's a scenario here whereby the Graf Spey still meets its fate at the Battle of River Plate. It still does. But it ends up there earlier because that's the richest pickings it can go to, which doesn't have a patrol. But the trouble is, because that's an area where they don't have aviation patrol, it's probably also going to be where you're going to find HMS Cumberland and maybe HMS Exeter, or maybe something heavier going, "Hello, I was waiting for you to arrive." Because that's what you do. Think about it from the hunter's perspective. I have set up lamps here, here, and here. The cunning prey knows to avoid those lamps because lamps are where danger lies. I can't set up a lamp there. I'll sit over there. The prey comes to me. And that's what you're talking about. These ships and their air groups might score very little in terms of success, in terms of actual kills themselves successfully, but as part of the overall force structure, they're going to be incredibly useful. Incredibly relevant. Runon keeps going away and coming back. I'm not sure what they're up to, but they're up to something. I think we should all be afraid. And then if we start talking about cumulative losses, and we talk about Atlantic, well, if you're able to prevent losses in terms, if let's say the Graf Spade isn't as successful and gets sunk earlier and more quickly, well, how's that going to affect Hitler's approach to large surface commands? As always, the worst case scenario, you had some operating off the coast of Canada, and maybe you had that agreement already agreed with Denmark, and so you had some operating off in Iceland, maybe, quietly operating somewhere off up there, and you spot the Deutschland. And instead of the Deutschland getting home safe, she gets caught by the Royal Navy. What would Hitler's reaction be if Germany got sunk by the Royal Navy? What would he do to his capital ship program? Would Bismarck and Tirpitz even get finished? Who knows? It's Adolf Hitler. This also is, well, we're talking about having these things in the air available well before 1939, well before the height of the submarine period, well before the height of success. This comes from an actual document. You can go and look it up. It's on the merchant, U.S. Merchant Marine, MM.org. It's their Allied merchant ship losses. I'll put it in the chat. And actually comes from a British document, but the British document is far harder to find than the American version, which comes in a British document. And that's what I was saying a link to. And the reason the British document is hard to find is the British keep the cumulative one for the end of the war. They don't keep the interim ones. But this is an interim one because it covers the point we'll be talking about. You see, if you reduce the losses early on, and a lot of these losses are down to surface ships, they're down to other problems going on, you're going to have an impact as time goes on. And this is before we get on to the loss of Courageous. As said, when she is lost, she is not that far from land. She really isn't. She is acting as part of service in the submarine, the hunter-killer groups in the western approaches. Okay? She is off the coast of Ireland. Now, the thing is, if you set up and got these aircraft in service, if you've got those aircraft, if you've got, you might not even have her doing that job. You might have a seaplane tender operating from Northern Ireland supporting it. You might have a seaplane tender operating from one of the various little islands off the coast, the Isle of Man or something like that, supporting their aircraft, providing aircraft in the western approaches. You might even have an agreement, informal agreement going with Ireland that they're going to look the other way if your seaplane tender sets up quietly on their coast. Probably not. But let's be honest, Ireland's neutrality is often an interesting intoxication of verbiage versus reality. But leaving that to one side, you might well not have Courageous or Ark Royal out hunting for submarines. Because again, even in their seagoing configuration, where they're just providing free aircraft, that might well be enough for that job. Do you need to have a full fleet carrier operating with only a couple of a single squadron of aircraft supporting those destroyers trying to hunt submarines, or is it better to have one of these vessels out there? Does anyone know who was in possession of the Azores and Canary Islands in World War II? Portugal and Spain. We talked about that at the beginning to extent. I didn't do the Canaries because they're not really in the flush point for this. The thing is, if you have these assets, then some of these early losses are going to be reduced. And that's going to have a cumulative impact. And because of the size of the German submarine fleet at the beginning of World War II, it was really hilarious compared to what it became. That's also going to have an impact if they lose some more submarines. It's going to have an impact if they lose some more surface ships. We haven't even got on to the whole scenario of Norway, etc. If you can get these assets into Norway when Norway falls. And yeah, if the seaplane carrier is sunk doing anti-submarine warfare instead of Courageous, that's terrible. But ultimately, Courageous is a more useful asset for the wider war effort. The ASW tender can do ASW, or the seaplane tender can do ASW operations. Losing it's going to be annoying. But there's also the scenario that you don't lose it because it's going to be a newer built hull, which is going to have newer and better subdivision, which is going to have, well, here is the real scenario. It's probably going to be smaller. Is it as worthwhile for the submarine to go kill that as it is for it to kill Courageous? Scott, Ireland was perfectly neutral Model 2. They just had terrible operational security and intelligence service, who routinely talked about U-boats they spotted in the cafe next to the UK embassy. It just gets worse. It gets far worse than that. It's just, yeah. And so this is what we're talking about. We're talking about a relatively small addition in force. We're talking roughly 24 merchant hulls being built to this standard. And being built between roughly 1934 to 1939. That's not going to cost a lot for the Royal Navy on the scale of naval spending at the time. It's not going to cost a lot in terms of yard space either. But it's going to provide a capability. And the thing is, you could also maybe get the Dominions to build some as well. Themselves. And you have to remember, a seaplane tender has everything that goes into an aircraft carrier but the lid on the top. So if you can build a seaplane tender, well, you've got a good chance of being able to build an aircraft carrier with a little bit of scaling up. And accumulation matters, because if you lose less and the enemy loses more at the beginning of the war, this is going to build up. That the losses sustained at the beginning of war will, how do I put this, have a disproportionate impact on the pre-war strength, i.e. the fully trained strength, the people who you're going to rely on to be the core of your armed forces for the rest of the war for the effectiveness. So the more you can damage the enemy at the beginning of the war, the less they will be able to rebuild and revitalize their forces as the war goes on. Converting a seaplane tender to a carrier, probably not, because they're not going to have the engines or be designed for the speed or have the hull size to do so. But that doesn't really matter. It's kind of like if you build a lot of sloops in the 1920s and 30s alongside destroyers. Because you're building the turbines for those sloops, they might not be designed to do the destroyer role, but the same things that you build for them are then what you turn around in a different hull and you build for a carrier. So you have to build up the infrastructure to build them. So when the turbines become a bottleneck for Royal Navy destroyer construction, they wouldn't be a bottleneck if you've been building those sloops, because you'd have the capacity to build the sloops in peacetime. That would have meant greater capacity overall. So if you've built the seaplane tender, you've now got the capacity to build the components. Therefore, you just need to build the hull. Oh, let's K. You are completely and utterly wrong. So let's put it this way. The same workshops, the same machine stores, all the same facilities. Now, if you're talking about they haven't got a hangar space, like an escort carrier, no, they haven't. But everything else, still need to support and sustain aircraft. And actually, you need more on a seaplane tender, because whereas on the escort carrier, your aircraft are going to do their best to avoid going into salt water. On the seaplane carrier, your aircraft regularly do go into salt water. So you're thinking this through in a sort of, you're sitting there going, well, no, surely they can't. No, they do. They have to have even more facilities in some regards. And storage space, again, they tend to have huge storage space and all the maintenance facilities. What they don't have is the hangar space. What they don't have is the flight deck space, because that's not what they're designed to do. So you have to think of them as instead of their airfield is the water around them, the harbour around them. But they have all the facilities internalized, all the factory tenders. They're like destroyer tenders, which have all those facilities. They're like all the other tender ships built. They are basically one-stop shop maintenance facilities. They're your mobile infrastructure hubs. So they have all those things. They have actually usually better than escort carriers do. Escort carriers, they're always complaining they didn't have enough workshop space. These would have had far more workshop space because they've been built for it. Because A, they're going to be built in peacetime, and B, as said, when you've got seaplanes, because they have to land in the salt water, you have to do a lot more maintenance. They're the hangar. No, they're not even the hangar. They're the storage. Because the aircraft will tend to be boxed down when they're installed under them. So, yeah. Oh, let's okay. Tenders are repair ships. I think you're getting confused. Tenders are repair ships. And we're talking about British parlance and even to an extent American parlance. Tenders are repair ships. A destroyer tender is its repair ship. A submarine tender is its repair ship. They are the repair ships. There are some ships which they will also tend to have accommodations and other facilities on them, and sometimes you'll have one which is a flotilla command tender, which might be more oriented around those things, but they are repair ships. So I think you're seeing a distinction which doesn't exist. I'm sorry to say. I think that's what you're missing. The one thing a seaplane carrier won't have that an aircraft carrier has is it won't have the lift. It'll have a crane. They have small engines and they merchant hulls. That's what makes them cheap. Because they don't need to go fast. They don't need to. They're not launching into the air. They're not doing anything like that. You gonna say hello to everyone, or are you going to go back to sleep? Oh, you're doing a big stretch. Okay. Good boy. So, these are the facts and figures. These are what are being lost, what are being worked through. And then we've got the impacts on the war in Mediterranean and Far East deterrence. Well, one of the interesting things in the war in Mediterranean is that Crete, etc., is famously where one of the mobile naval basing units really do take a lead. And it's then handed over to the army, but it was under the control of mobile naval basing forces, and that's why there was a Royal Marines Major General in charge, and all those things. Well, imagine if Crete's already got a functioning airfield and functioning support thanks to those facilities being there. Repair ships didn't tend to be costly, because of their facilities. They tended to be, in many ways, they're not going to be cheap, but they're also it's going to sound strange, but machine tools, because they're the similar tools that you have lots of factories using anyway, and all the other ships have to some extent anyway, they're actually not that expensive to buy because it's something that you can. There are already large quantities being built, so it's specialist, but it's not massively expensive. Cardabrants, repair ships, set up and fitted out as generic ship repair facilities. Tenders, or tend to be what we call them. Tenders. And sometimes there are... The US Navy has specific repair ships, which they occasionally have set operation, but they tend to sometimes call them salvage tenders as well. And, yeah. Build rates are being asked for. There are lots of ships like this. There are lots of tenders like that in OLXK. If you look up the US Navy, if you go and search the seaplane tenders, you'll find out they have about 40 of them, I think. Let me just check that figure. They have the Kernick, which have... Let's see. They have Kernick, which are 4, Kenneth Whitting's 4, Tangiers 3, Sadat's 11, 31 Barraguettes, 2 Curtis, and 2 other ones, including, of course, the USS Langley. So, by my count, that's 46. They're also a nice way. Okay, those are people that they have anyway. The skilled labourers, machine tools, all those things. They're all things the Navy has anyway, in quite large numbers. Again, we're not talking about navies like today, where we're talking. In the Royal Navy is about 20,000 personnel and this sort of that. We're talking a Navy which was several 100,000 personnel strong. There's a difference in finding personnel at this point. It's just for the air. It doesn't matter whether the personnel, the aircraft are operated from a land base or a sea base. It's the same personnel you'd be using. So it doesn't matter to an extent. So anyway, if we go back to Crete, Crete is a mobile naval basing unit, and it's their operation, their organisation, what they're putting together. Now, if you add in some of these turning up, well, that's going to support a lot of infrastructure for the airfields, because one of the things you have, if you have an airbase there and you're trying to set an airbase, try and support and sustain it. But if you have the machine shops turn up on the tender, then they can support their aircraft, but they can also support the aircraft operating ashore. Yeah, it's not a sexy area, OLXK. They don't get mentioned. Now, I think that's an Italian ship. That's not a Royal Navy one. That's an Italian. It's a Royal Navy aircraft carrier. The whole point with the Mediterranean is that if you've got Crete with these things on there, that's going to add to the defence of Crete. And there's other islands. There's the Dodecanese. There's all these little islands, which, frankly, if you've got this facility and you can set them up quickly and turn those areas quickly into air bases that you can sustain and operate, that's going to add to their defences a lot. Now, if we consider the defence of Crete, one of the things that you find missing from it, when you start looking around it, is a large number of aircraft. But one of the things the Royal Air Force complained was actually sustaining and supporting those aircraft. Again, if you have the facilities to go and get there, to support them, if you have these ships wandering around, they can turn up and will be useful assets. The main aircraft which were used by the Royal Air Force to try and defend it were the Bristol Blenheim, the Gloucester Gladiator, and some Hawker Hurricanes. And again, you can add the same into the Far East. If you've got Catalinas, if you've got these ships able to wander around and turn up bases, even if you've got if you've got, let's say, a modified Fulmar, but still relying on the Supermarine Walrus, etc., and all those other historic aircraft that the British operated, you've got a very useful tool for reconnaissance. And one of the reasons why the Royal Air Force sends the famous message, which there's no air support available, when they mean there's no strike aircraft available, not there's no fighters available, is because the strike aircraft have been worn out doing a lot of reconnaissance missions, and they can't sustain their operations because they don't have enough reconnaissance aircraft, and they're all trying to operate from Singapore. Well, if you have these, you can have them forward. You can be moving them around. You can be sustaining them. And again, one of the advantages of these seaplane tenders is, to an extent, they're expendable. You prefer not to lose them. But again, compared to an aircraft carrier, a full-blown aircraft carrier, they're not as expensive. And if you don't lose the Catalinas, worst comes to worst, what you do is then have to take a merchant ship in hand and convert it to the same level. Now, I would argue, Ben Grogan, I know you've just asked this question, but I will actually add to it, because I think I mentioned it, but I'm going to discuss it a bit more as we go on. I think they'd add to it, because your question is, would they add or detract from the USNRN carriers overall? They'd add to it. Because especially if it's early in the 1930s. The thing is, the shipboard flights are some of the first to convert over to full Royal Navy control, rather than the carrier flights, the shipboard flights. These aircraft will be covered under the shipboard flights, so they'd actually mean that the Royal Navy probably A, achieve control of the Fleet Air Arm earlier, but B, also be able to grow its strength a lot earlier. Alex K, the Swordfish is regularly in float plane configuration. This is one operating off Malaya. It was a float plane Swordfish which was being used by Warspite at Narvik. Float plane Swordfish are quite a common sight from Royal Navy battleships in the 1939, 1940, 1941 period. They're a core part of it. Wouldn't be a float plane fighter variant, but it could. The thing is about the Swordfish is it could take off with floats and a torpedo. So it was a float plane strike aircraft. And that's an advantage for the Royal Navy. And again, think about this. Again, with albacore, float planes, etc. If you've got these vessels in service, you can use them a lot. You can have them as you can have them around the whole of the world, providing Britain with a strike capability, a capability against surface raiders. It's one of the constant problems Britain has is providing maritime patrol aircraft to cover all the areas they need to patrol to support their cruisers. And one of the reasons why you have things like HMS Sydney going off in the route it is doing without support is because there aren't enough maritime patrol aircraft around. And the reason there aren't enough maritime patrol aircraft around is not always because they don't have enough aircraft, it's because they don't have enough bases to support them. They don't have the frigging infrastructure. One of the really interesting points for the Far East and the Mediterranean is this is while you're building the infrastructure, these ships could provide the cover until the infrastructure is built. And then once the infrastructure is built, you move the ship away to go do something else. That's something which cannot be overlooked as an advantage. Again, the point I make, and I will continue to make regularly, is world wars are marathons, not sprints. They're about cumulative. And sometimes a very small addition to your force can have a massive impact in the cumulative. Not because of what it does in the primary theatre, because of the resources it frees up from secondary and tertiary theatres. Because every time you have a problem in a secondary theatre, let's consider this, the Graf's Bay. You have two 8-inch gun heavy cruisers, as they're so called at the time, a full fat county and a cut price county, Cumberland and Exeter hunting her. You have 6-inch light cruisers hunting her, Leander class. Again, very good ships, very recent built ships. You have all sorts of assets hunting this vessel down. One of the problems you have is you don't have enough aircraft carriers and you don't have enough air cover to go around to really cover the distance you need to do. And you don't have enough ships. But you're having to use primary assets, warfighting assets, primary theatre assets, to go hunting it down. The only secondary theatre asset which is actually deployed hunting it is HMS Exeter. Because that's technically part of the reason why they built the cut price counties, was they were supposed to be able to provide the necessary firepower in the secondary and tertiary theatres. You deal with assets like the Graf's Bay, like the Deutschland, earlier in their campaign, because you have these vessels present. And as I said, it's not necessarily by them finding it, it's by them removing down a number of spaces where they can be. Because that's what air reconnaissance usually provides. It narrows down the spaces where the enemy is likely to be. That all has an impact. It can have an impact on the Mediterranean. It can have an impact in terms of providing support for operations from Malta, from Gibraltar, especially if you have Catalinas in service as part of this with the Royal Navy earlier on. You imagine a couple of these ships turn up in a port, somewhere off the coast of Africa. They set themselves up. They're each carrying a squadron of walruses, 3 ready to go, and 9 in boxes, which they unbox once they get there. And then 12 Catalinas show up. They fly in. And across the 2 ships, they carry all the resources, everything they need for their little wing. 2 squadrons of walruses and a squadron of Catalinas flying from a little port off the coast of Africa. That's a very large net you've just thrown over that area. And that has an impact. Because whilst they may or may not kill anything, surface raiders are going to start avoiding that area because it's more sensible for them to do it, because surface raiders have a glass jaw. And the same with submarines. You're operating on a surface in that area, you might get hit. You might get spotted. It's better to operate elsewhere. And yes, you are going to need to take torpedo nets. Yes, you are. As I said earlier, one will probably come with some with some facilities to build the bits ashore you need to provide further support for the aircraft, and one will probably have to come with sea defense, some 6-inch guns, etc., which can be put out as a coastal battery, and maybe they'll deploy some extra AA guns, and maybe they'll deploy a radar up a nearby hill, and some anti-torpedo netting, etc., at the harbour entrance. Probably carry some boats to monitor the net and manage the net. But those are all things you can build into the design. And this is not beyond the wit of the Royal Navy at the time, because guess what the Mobile Naval Basing Unit has? Have a look at what some of their description of some of their facilities are, and that's literally out of it. Now, yes, the US Navy didn't have tenders embarked, but the Royal Navy tenders tended to do so. So this is a differential, okay? So this is something which this is why I'm talking the way I am talking. I want to emphasize that because Carl Zoba has pointed this out, but I did want to emphasize that as well myself. They are forward aviation support ships for seaplanes, yes. But also they're this. They set up in a place, and they set up the infrastructure facilities, and suddenly you have something there which is already set up that when the merchant ship brings in the aircraft, the aviation supplies, they can do some assembly so that when Unicorn comes along, they've already started the process that Unicorn picks up and then takes with her. And they can also do maintenance, and they can also for repair. You're setting up a forward aviation base that Unicorn can run to and back from, which reduces some of the pressure on Unicorn and her sister if her sister gets built. But also, you can move this base forward. It makes sense for the Pacific campaign against the Japanese. Remember, I've talked about rolling up. It makes sense to a loss of strategy in terms of how you operate how you operate around the world for Britain. And the fact is, with Britain having the short Sunderlands as well, suddenly you have an asset which can literally be used to deliver some of the logistics. I need engines taken out to this base. Short Sunderland can take it out there. It can be supported and get it back. In fact, if you look at it, all the components, all the things we're talking about are actually already there in their form in the Royal Navy in the 1930s, let alone in World War II, and yet they don't have the ships which tie it all together. And that becomes really interesting. This is HMAS Albatross. This is the vessel built for the Australians because they couldn't get an aircraft carrier, so they built a seaplane carrier. A seaplane tender. She's a really interesting vessel. She really is. She is launched in 1928. She's transferred to the Royal Navy in 1945, but we'll leave that to one side. And decommissioned in 1933. No, she's traded to the Royal Navy in 1938. Sorry, got that one. Brain fart. Apologies. She's given to them as part payment for HMAS Hobart. And she's a very useful vessel again. Looks like a badly mangled county-class hull. Well, she is built by Cockatoo Docks and Engineering Company, so don't think of it as a county-class hull. Think of it as a C-class hull. And suddenly you have a realization of what's going on here. They're 4,800 ton standards. 4,800 tons in standard. She could carry 9 aircraft, 6 in active configuration, 3 in box configuration. She had 3 recovery cranes. She had a top speed of 22 knots. She had 4 4.7-inch guns, some pom-poms, some saluting guns, a whole host of machine guns. And realistically, she spends her career being used at Freetown in West Africa. Her aircraft provide for convoy escort, ASW warfare, and air-sea rescue in Atlantic until 1942, May, when she's sent to the Indian Ocean. And then she provides support for the landings at Mayette in the Madagascar campaign. And then she takes on trade protection duties in pretty much the Indian Ocean until July 1943. She's paid off in September 1943 and then brought back, has a full conversion in between October 33 to 44 to a landing ship engineering as part of support for Normandy. In the never-ending, we will do a thing against Royal Navy logistic ships to support amphibious operations. We will take away their fast tankers and convert them to amphibious ships to carry landing craft, and we will take away an aviation support vessel, but let's be honest, in 1943 it doesn't matter so much, to provide engineering support for amphibious operations. Yes, that is the aircraft storage area. Now the thing is, not much more effort would turn this into something which could quite happily carry 12 aircraft. As I said, 3 operational and 9 in boxes. After all, she carries 9 aircraft, 6 operational and 3 in boxes. So, you know, not much more space. Stick on some more, maybe stick some more supplies. I would argue, round out the hull to make it this size full length. Give yourself some more space, storage, etc. But, you know, there are things you can do. Maybe store the lighter alongside the hull, etc. Or have a deck for it aft, or store it on the flight deck, on this portion of the deck. You know, it's up to you what you do with it. But there are options. And the point with this design and talking about it is, it wasn't a dead science building seaplane tenders. It wasn't something silly supporting them. The main arguments put up against them in Britain was A, the ease of building airfields, which was tended to be argued by the Air Ministry. It's also the same argument they had against aircraft carriers. And B, the fact that the threats were contained, so why do we need them? So one is a inter-service politics argument, and one is a self-serving economics argument. Neither of which are realistically good arguments, but they do tend to win the day. And that's honestly the trouble when we're talking about naval aviation and fleet tenders and support of ships like this, is the issues with winning the arguments. You see, sometimes the argument will be had, and the argument that wins is not the best argument, it's the one which is made most persuasive, or as rather, is most persuasive to the audience listening. And that's what we also have to think about when arguments are being made. One of the things you learn when you look through history is that sometimes the reason a decision goes the way it goes is not because people honestly felt it was the best. It's just it was argued the best. It was argued the most persuasively. And so they went with it. And the thing is, anyone who's ever made an argument for something in their life knows, anyone who's ever made a logical defense of why something should be done will know. The trick is not necessarily making the best argument or making the best argument from the evidence. It's making the argument from evidence which best resonates with the audience. And the thing is, when you're making an argument against seaplane tenders, making an argument we're not going to need them is great with the Treasury. They ultimately control the funding, and the people who want to spend money on other things are the people who don't want to raise money. So that's some good people to have on your side. There's going to be a large number in the room in the Parliament. And making the case that, you know, we might as well build airfields anyway are better. Well, land airfields are better. Let's be honest. A land-based airfield is always going to have more space than an aircraft carrier or a seaplane tender. It's always going to have more space. You can always have more hangars. You can always operate, in theory, far more aircraft. Because you can add on another runway, or another 2 runways, or another 3 runways. You can add on a dozen hangars. You can add on whole massive ammunition stores which can be buried the size of football pitches beneath the ground. All those things can be added because A land base, you can expand on as much land as you can get hold of. Whereas a ship, it's a finite amount of space, and it's very difficult to expand without causing trouble from a naval architecture perspective. But the thing is, that all comes with a cost. And that airbase can only really support things which are within range of it. And operations which are in range of it. And you still need to sustain it. You still need to supply it. You still need the infrastructure in place to make sure it has what it needs to operate. And you still need to defend it. I found it interesting the other day when someone's going, well, an airbase only needs one battery of Patriots to defend it. An aircraft carrier needs 4 Arleigh Burkes. And my perspective when immediately went, that's not as good a brag as you think it is, because the sheer amount of attacks which will need to penetrate 4 Arleigh Burkes will have drained a single battery of Patriots far more quickly because of the amount of resources they carry with them. I think I'm not sure. I'm not sure if. I think I was praying that Habitual Line Crosser responded to that, because that would have just been funny. But it was basically, it was the most silly argument, because realistically you'd want 4. They said it was a single launcher. They didn't even say a single battery. They said a single launcher of Patriots, and it was a case of, what the frigate are you on? Nope. They'll run out of missiles long before they run out of targets. But the thing is, you need these things for different reasons. If you don't want to build hundreds of air bases around the world, but you still want to be able to cover critical points when you need to, and you're not sure where those critical points are going to be depending on the scenario, then a seaplane tender is a perfectly sensible asset. A perfectly viable asset. In this period. If you need to have mobile fleet support for your fleet, you want to have an aircraft carrier. You want to have organic fleet air defense and organic fleet air support in terms of strike capability. You want an aircraft carrier, because it moves with it, and it can operate from it, and provide it with the operational capability it needs. Those are different things. There are various people putting down and going, well, 8 launches in battery, 4 missiles per launcher, that's 32 missiles. Yeah. 4 Burkes, that's what, roughly... 388? No, 384 missiles. Probably, let's say some of them are going to be Talams, so let's say roughly 25% of those are Talams and other things. Takes it down to, what, 278? Yeah, it's a different scenario. And the thing is, the 1 bomb per runway only works when you're dealing with heavy aircraft which need a tarmac Adam runway. And even then, if you've got the proper facilities nearby, you can repair that. But the thing is, destroying a runway is one thing. Destroying the fuel farm, the ammunition dump, and all the other things which sustain the airfield, that can take a lot longer to fix than the runway. So, the point is, you have these things, and the arguments are going to be made. Not necessarily going to be good arguments, but they're going to be... the effective argument is going to win. And that's what happened. When you look through this, and you start to look at the arguments around trade protection being put forward in the 1920s and 30s, the arguments which win are the self-serving ones. And they're sometimes the ones which back the Royal Navy into a corner. One of the more interesting ones is basically, so are you saying the Royal Navy is not able to seal the Regia Marina up into the Mediterranean? And of course, the Admiral can't say no. They can't, because if he does, then he's just undermined the entire purpose of the Royal Navy. But the fact is that the Italians might have a merchant trader already out sitting in the Atlantic. They might have something operating off in the East African, their territory in East Africa, etc. There are options for them. So he can't also say he can seal them in, and he makes an argument about that, and he does, but it sounds mealy-mouthed. It sounds like he's going, well, yes, we can, but there could be this and this. And he'll go, well, in that scenario, I suppose you'll just have to dispatch assets to it, but we don't think that's much of a problem. Yeah. And Frank Bauer, you are right about the whole defences and capabilities. The fact is, a Burke is designed to haul that sheer amount of firepower around with it. That's why ships are the size they are. That's why the ships keep growing. It's the size of the missiles and it's the number of the missiles they're carrying. It's the same with why do aircraft carriers grow in size? Because of the number of aircraft they're carrying and the size of those aircraft keep getting bigger. That's it. People keep going, oh, aircraft carriers shouldn't be built so big these days. Okay, well, that's fine. Make smaller aircraft. They go, well, we'd like, but then the aircraft can't do this, this, and this. No, it can't. That's the problem. You want the aircraft to be multi-role, it's going to be a bigger aircraft. A single-role aircraft can be built around a single function and can be made very easily. The moment an aircraft is multi-role, things get complicated. The moment it's multi-role and multi-function, then that's really, really complicated. And it's going to grow in size because of that. So yeah. Right then, on to, let's say, questions for roughly half an hour. Rather enjoyed this. Wondering who's chatting away on Twitch, and because I'm kind of enjoying this because I got about 8 viewers on Twitch, which is cool. We peaked at about 15 at one point. We're at 8, and we've got 70 odd viewers on YouTube. So if you've got any questions, happy to answer them. We don't have the question bot active like we do on Brew Ships on Sunday, but that's because there are less people asking questions usually on the lives like this on the first day. But you know, I hope you enjoyed them. I hope you've enjoyed them starting to come to Twitch. I know it's something different than you normally find on a lot of Twitch, but I thought it'd be quite cool to start doing it on Twitch as well as YouTube and keep doing it on, and I think it's proving quite popular. Yeah, the UK did operate out the Azores in World War II. Basically, at a certain point, someone asked the Portuguese for their copy of the old alliance agreement, the Treaty of Perpetual Friendship, and the Portuguese very kindly provided their copy to the Royal Navy, to Britain, and they went, "Oh yeah, we can operate from there." And the Portuguese, when the Spanish turned around and said, "Are you sure?" The Portuguese went, "We have a tradition of alliance and friendship with the British going back centuries." Yeah, okay. So, 96831. Yes, there are free carriers planned. Free armoured carriers planned. This is the point. But only one has been laid down, and one more is in the process of ordering. The other one is not had any decisions made about names or anything yet. So, and hasn't even had names considered. So the thing is, they're being ordered every other every other financial year. So, you know, HMS Unicorn. She is ordered in April 1939. Her next sister was supposed to be ordered in April 1941, and there was another one supposed to be ordered possibly in April 1943 if needed. So, yeah. There is nothing about name. And HMS Pegasus was sitting next to Royal Oak in October 19 in Scapa Flow in October 1939 doing her duty. She's the one who recovers most of the survivors from actually the Royal Oak. So yeah, she's useful. Again, do you foresee modern seaplanes ever making a comeback to military? Probably not. Again, there's so many compromises which has to go into making a seaplane work. It's just, I can't see the situation where it's useful for it as where it's another utility. However, in terms of what we're talking about, there is a scenario where they could come back, and that is in logistics. In terms of having something which can actually land and recover from and launch from water, which is sort of the size of a Hercules. The Japanese do have flying boats, rather than necessarily the seaplanes, huge ones, which they use for ASW operations. And again, that is something which you have to consider. Search and rescue and for supply of islands. But I don't see them really coming back other than those sort of areas of niche capability. But they're useful for that. Okay, so senders could arrive, set up shop at some location over a few weeks, and become a kind of local maintenance facility for all sorts of machinery. Yes. That's literally what they do. They set up. And it's kind of funny when you start looking at some of the ports in World War II which are used, and we talk about the port facilities, then you look at the maintenance, it's actually a tender which is doing most of the work. It's a tender which is set up. When you start to look at some of the ports in Egypt, etc., in Alexandria, from a lot of the earlier war, the major maintenance facilities, the major facility doing the work are, in terms of the ships and maintaining the components, are the tenders which are in that which are being put in there. Baron, do you see tenders being used as close convoy support in each run, or would they be more likely to be used as roving elements in Atlantic? They might be used, because they could be used as catapult ships for catapult fighters, etc. But I think they probably have more viability supporting things like, especially if you've got Catalinas. I think the big interesting thing is the question is if they buy Catalinas. If they got some Catalinas in service, especially prior to World War II, suddenly the seaplane tenders are incredibly useful in supporting those, so they won't risk them for the convoys. They might be out doing what Courageous is doing and Ark Royal are doing at the beginning of the war when they're searching for anything to do that job. But and they're prepared, if they're prepared to risk a fleet carrier, they'll be prepared to risk something like this. But especially if you've got more of them in service, but if you've got Catalinas available, then frankly, it's far better to have them sitting somewhere quietly operating the Catalinas than to have them with the convoy. Nice around. So with these seaplane tenders, how do you avoid a repeat of the Ben Maishari disaster, which the Ronnie was lucky that all the war got out? You have a decent aviation fuel management system, which is what they would do. And a few other things as well, probably a lot more fire defences. And probably they would be purpose-built, whereas Ben Maishari was conversion. She was a ferry converted. So yeah. Yeah. My gosh, Japanese got brilliant idea to reconnoiter the Philippines. Tanker submarine to refuel flying boats. USN. Where could they have refueled them? Send the Tangier to French frigate shoals. Yeah. It works, though. Tanker submarines. It worked. From just throwing out the idea of either the USA or UK use some IJ and tone like shit. Well, the thing is, you build a tone when you're not got enough carriers. And that doesn't really help either force. It's not a proper cruiser, and certainly wouldn't want to be used as a proper cruiser. And it's not really a proper aviation ship. It's what you build that the Japanese build because of the situation they're in. For the Royal Navy, they can build enough cruisers, they prefer to keep building cruisers, and they could, if they're building these, they prefer to have these. They would prefer not to have the in-betweens. They have enough ships. A tone is something you do when you cannot build enough ships physically for some reason. When you do actually have the theoretical ability to build enough ships, you don't do the tone. Because it's so many compromises. No, the Belfast was always going to be roughly 12 guns, and the Belfast, there was a plan that they were going to continue Belfast and Edinburgh, they were going to have 16 guns and 2 quadruple turrets, and there were ideas, but the biggest plan they ever really got was 4 aircraft aboard, and of those, 2 would be in box formation, or they would maybe have 6 with 1 stored on the launch capacitor, 3 boxed and 2 in the hangar. But yeah, they're not really being built as aviation vessels. They're not being built like the Tony. It's a different form, definitely. It's not having its entire ship rearranged for the aviation facilities. Oh, there's all sorts of discussions. There goes. Sometimes it's 6, sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's 4, depending on which point of discussion you're taking on. Practically, they usually operate 2 if they're operating aircraft. But if you follow the design study, it's a really interesting thing to go through. Okay, I wonder if there are any funny stories or traditions for plane ship maintenance like this. Not really. Again, one of those things about maintenance is it's one of those boring jobs which you have to do to keep the ship going. You just have to do it. Oh, Ben Grogan, there's a very easy answer to the question of that if the tenders are at sea and Courageous and Ark Royal are not sunk. Well, if Courageous, let's be honest, if Courageous is not sunk, then there is odds on chance that Glorious isn't sunk because those two would probably be operating together in Norway. Which means there'd probably be a rear admiral present and there'd probably be aircraft in the air. Which means they are fast enough that if they spot the Shardos and Eisenhower early enough, they can probably get away from them and keep away from them. But more also, they can possibly launch an airstrike, and they might not even be in the situation they're in the first place. There's also the fact that if you have more flight decks, then Ark Royal doesn't get as overused as she does, so she probably gets better maintained. She might not get sunk, therefore, the situation. And whatever happens, if you have 2 to 3 more flight decks available because of cumulative the accumulation scenario, A, you probably have a larger strike at Taranto, and B, you probably have at least 1 carrier with Force Z, because let's be honest, if Courageous and Glorious, by the time you're talking, you're getting into December 1941, they're not going to be your frontline carriers at that point. They're not going to be but they're perfectly fine for sending out to Force Z, with Force Z. Send out one of them, or if you have both of them, great, send out both. with 4Z, and they're going to provide be able to support enough aircraft, enough sort of fighters and strike aircraft. And the big accumulation is that going to be those air crews and how they filtered into growing the Navy, the damage control specialists and how they filtered into the wider Navy in terms of not damage control on Ark Royal and other scenarios if they need it. It's such a massive butterfly. It's very hard to predict, but it's just going to work. It's as in more scenarios, usual scenarios. When you have more options, you tend to make better decisions. Because instead of going, your how to put this, often in a scenario you're challenged with going with the least bad option. If you have more options to choose from, the least bad tends to be a better option than the least bad if you have lesser options to pick from. Yep, the Gotland, I've talked about her before. She is a very nice ship. Year of the Aircraft Carrier. I did a video about the Gotland. She's a good ship. Alex K, the Japanese bombers attacking 4C didn't have fighter escort. They had no fighter escort. If you'd had fighters doing an air defense, that would have broken up the strikes, and then you could have dealt with them in a nicest way. The whole thing was they were able to concentrate their strikes. If they'd had their strikes broken up at range by fighters, they'd have probably never made it. And they were running low on fuel anyway, because they'd been searching for long, so they'd have been in real trouble. It wouldn't have made it immortal, but it would have made sure 4C would have survived that strike, and that would have probably led to ABDA command being formed up on 4C, which would have changed the whole Southeast Asia campaign, and that could have had an impact on operations. It's a on-running thing. And as said by others, their extreme edge of range, they're really in a bad position. 4C is really a case of it's the Japanese roll sixes. They really do. It's a very, very lucky scenario for them. Sea Hurricanes were the main thing they were deploying, so perfectly fine. They've been doing rather well in the Mediterranean, and Wildcats as well. So I don't think you can. I don't think that's really going to have much of a problem against Bettys with running low on fuel. When you're talking about a Royal Navy which has been through the Mediterranean, will have been through the Mediterranean conflict at this point, so and will have been still doing the fighter command operations they did there. John Self, looking at HMS Outros, which you said was like a mangled C-class hull, Night was over a dozen C-class was scrapped. Would it be better to use those hulls for Seaplane Tenders rather than merchant hull? Not really. Honestly, because converting a hull to that is just going to be a nightmare. It's going to be far more expensive than building a new hull. Far easier to build a new hull and make it work. And basically, if the 4C is surviving and you've now got 2 fast capital ships built around 2 fleet carriers, and you've maybe got Saratoga comes up and joins up with them, she's in that area, and the other assets that are in that area end up getting deployed up there by the Americans, you could have quite a big force form up in Southeast Asia, which could force the Japanese to have to deploy a major fleet down there. No, they didn't have the Kido Batai heading for them at that point, 96 everyone. The Kido Batai were nowhere near them at that point. The Kido Batai were going home to rearm, refuel, and repair themselves. They weren't going to be available for at least a month and a half. By the time the Kido Batai formed up and are doing operations, it's called Operation C, and at that point, British have Indomitable and Illustrious sitting in the Indian Ocean. And so the odds are you'd have Indomitable and Illustrious formed up with Force Z and the Eastern Fleet established, based on this new force, with probably Warspite and other assets added in. Those got a biplane with a pilot who a pistol would work. The Birdies didn't have any guns. They've been moved to say wait for the extra fuel. It is. They are in real trouble. So yeah. Force Z was basically was Churchill's idea. The Royal Navy wanted to deploy them to Ceylon. He wanted to deploy them to Singapore because he believed that the presence of two such capital ships would deter the Japanese by showing how powerful the Royal Navy was. The British government the Royal Navy correctly felt that showing they could only deploying two ships would suggest all they could deploy were two ships. That was a problem. I see. Now, okay. What would you think of an idea of an idea for a special reconnaissance operation where Tender deploys a few seaplanes with supplies over a few points of an Asian coast where they would launch recon assaults? What are you aiming to do with it? What's your point? What's your operation? It depends on what you're hoping to achieve and what you're hoping to do. So Force Z, plus 2 UK carriers, and probably at least one other carrier. So we'd actually have 3 carriers, 3 British carriers, plus Saratoga, plus remnants of the US Asiatic Fleet, and plus the Dutch, and the other ships that are put in there for the Eastern Fleet, so the R's and all the other things. That suddenly becomes a very large force that you've got to send a very large force to engage. And one of the things if the Japanese do gather the Kido Battalion, do try and send them down there, the Americans might pulse their other carriers there. They might do that to have a large meeting engagement. Instead of you having Midway and Coral Sea, you might have a massive battle in the Singapore area or around the Dutch areas. Either way, you're going to have a very different scenario than you did historically, because you've got such a large force there. The Japanese are going to have to deploy in force, and so others will deploy it. Yeah, you deploy basically in what you do is, why are you concealing the seaplanes in the jungle during the day? There's all sorts of things you've got. What you do with the seaplane carriers, you set it up in a harbour, you put up defences around it, and the seaplanes go out. If you're trying having the seaplanes patrolling in the day is one of the key things that they're patrolling, because they can see further at day, because they're still doing a lot of visual patrol in this period. They're not doing radar. Some of them do have radar. Most of them are Royal Navy operated ones, which have ASV or Coastal Command. But the fact is that doesn't give them a massive range of view, because radars aren't the things we have today. So yeah, they're going to be a useful asset, but you're still going to be doing daytime patrols, etc. So again, there's no real point, and you're not going to be You might try and hide if you've got a suitable bay that you can tuck the tender up against the shore, and you can stick that so it's hidden a bit by the jungle and made it look like the Dutch vessel which tried to hide as an island. And maybe you tuck the other hangar facilities and the pull away things ashore in the jungle where you can. You would certainly try and do that. It's always good to do some camouflage, but it's a case of, again, the patrol operations are gonna be carried out because you've got to keep up that patrol to keep up their knowledge of what's going on. Hello, good boy. As in, the IJA have Yamatos, but they don't deploy the Yamatos down that direction. They have them, they don't deploy them. As we talked about before, when the Japanese enter the Indian Ocean, they have Congos with them. And there's a good chance that Warspite Solo, if she gets the Congos in the middle of the night, could do some hefty damage to them. She might not come off the berg perfectly, but if she does enough damage that they get slowed down, the four R's with her as well get involved in the fight, they're in trouble. But if you've now got Prince of Wales, Repulse, Warspite, and 4 R's as part of that force, then yeah, If the Japanese bring the Congos down, that's not exactly a fair fight if those Congos stay to have that fight, is it? And if the Americans reinforce, or if this, this is the scenarios you're dealing with in this scenario. The Japanese? Yes, they have Yamatos, but do they ever deploy them? Not that far south. They would be Congo territory. And if you have 3 Royal Navy carriers and a USN carrier, that's 4 carriers for starters operating together. And whilst the Royal Navy carriers don't tend to have the same strike ability, as in terms of they don't carry the same number of aircraft, so they don't launch an alpha strike like they can launch an alpha strike, but they don't tend to rely on the alpha strike like the Americans, because they're not built around that design because of the treaty limits and saving tonnage orientation treaty. The British carriers are designed around perpetual operations and perpetual fighter operations and perpetual strikes and perpetual reconnaissance. So the thing is, the British are going to have advantages in that way, and the British are also designed around launching mass night strikes of their fleet. They do that a lot. So that's a very different scenario. Again, you've got 3 in this scenario you're talking about. You could have 3 Royal Navy carriers and a Saratoga. So yeah, it's just going to be a very different thing. You'd have to war game out to have any idea what would happen. And the thing is, there are no American carriers really anywhere near where 4C happens at the time. But the thing is, again, if 4C survives that initial... The thing is, these things happen so quickly, in such quick order, that you don't have time to react. If 4C survives longer because its carrier has a carrier of it which fighters manage to ward off those Bettys... And the other thing about having a carrier with them is that's going to mean it's going to be doing air control. So those fighters listening in Singapore are going to hear the fighter controls going on from the carrier to its own fighters and are going to launch to go and assist. So they're going to have the Buffaloes coming in as well as the Hurricanes and Wildcats if they're carrying them. They're going to have that as their availability. That's going to change things. That's the integration. That's the operation they have. Yeah, the trouble is the tenders. If the tender isn't staying in place, you have to protect it. The whole point about a tender was if it stays in place, it protects itself. It can deploy its own protections around it. And the thing is, it's not high enough a value target realistically on its own for the enemy to launch a major force to go and get it. And that's the thing, because it's for secondary and tertiary theatres, not for primary theatres. That's what your aircraft carrier is for, because that is mobile and designed to operate its air group as mobility. And that's the other thing, you might get Renown deployed out if Repulse is still around. Repulse is not sunk. So you could have Renown Repulse, Warspite, Prince of Wales, and 4Rs. That's a fairly decent line of that's a fairly decent battle line, isn't it? Carol, Hosho and Zuho was at Pearl Harbor, specifically screening the Bagheera Bataille. Yeah. More about Seaplane Tender operations. Well, actually, I do have a book to talk about the various things we've been discussing. If I can find it. There is... Anti-Submarine Warfare in World War One by John Alberto. And that looks a very grey, boring book, but actually it's pretty darn cool. And I have Mobile Naval Bases, MONABs, which I will find my copy of because it's somewhere around here. He says, hunting it furiously. I know. I know it's bedtime, but you haven't been called yet. They'll call you when it's time for your bedtime. I know they're messing with the Ralsolian Canada, but the Ralsolian Canada cannot dictate everyone's life. Occasionally the Ralsonian calendar has to accept others. Yes, it does. Occasionally the Ralsonian calendar has to accept that other people have a choice about their times of operation. I know. You want to go to bed, have your bicky, you know, all those things you normally do at this point of the day, but you're just going to have to wait till you're called. You're just going to have to wait until you're called. You'll hear them coming, I'm sure. Poodles. Where is it? Where is that book? I was reading it like 3 hours ago. Maybe I was reading it last night. I was reading it though. I'm sorry the Ralsonian calendar is being upset. I am apologise for it. It is most terrible of the humans of the household to be upsetting the Ralsonian calendar. We will deal with it though. War Plan Orange covers how the Americans plan to use seaplane carriers quite well. This book, which is by Edward S. Miller. But I do have Monabs somewhere, he says. Looking for it. I can hear your brother woofing, so maybe it's getting time, Big Fluff. Maybe it's getting time. Oh, is that it? Have I done that to myself? Oh, I have, haven't I? No. That's my engines book. Where is it? Where have I? Apologies. Ay, caramba. He's always feeling fancy and always enjoying wearing his bow tie. Monabs, Mobile Naval Air Base. You need a lending library. No, actually, what I need is a checking and checking out system on that door. That's what I need. Because it's either that or I need to start locking my door to the rest of because of my annex to the rest of the house. Because, yes, someone walks in here, gainfully grabs something and disappears off, and then it gets put back. I'm not sure if that's what's happened this time, or if I put it down somewhere. There are quite a lot of books, and you have to remember that all the bookshelves are double stacked. All of them are double stacked. All of them have 2 to 3 layers of books on them. Yeah. All of them. All of them have a lot of bookies. Will this keep you amused for a couple of seconds? Good boy. Oh, there is the Pacific Clipper as well. That was Gareth the Brit has done an excellent book about excellent stuff about that. He does an excellent presentation on it as well. Oh, good lord! I know you've got a Bally. I gave it to you. It's a very cute Bally. It truly is. And I was playing with it with you earlier. I know you have a Bally. You're a good boy. So, any more questions? Let's see. Renown, Repulse, Prince of Wales are as fast, can probably match up with all 4 Congress. It'd be a coin toss, but they'd be able to do it. Well, the thing is, whilst they're fast, usually the Congos are in 2s or 3s. Very rarely it's all 4. And you've also got Warsprite coming along going, hello. Seaplane Tenders didn't play much of a role in the D-Day landings, but again, that's the same reason you don't have aircraft carriers in the D-Day landings, because you don't really need them there, because you've got so many aircraft you can deploy from the UK because of the range, that having aircraft carriers or even seaplane tenders in the D-Day landings just adds to the complexity of the operations. It means you have to clear more of the minefields, more space for them to operate. Hello. You happy now? It's always a classic scenario. You can have these assets, but anything you have to support, you have to sustain, and you have to provide space for it to operate. And if you're deconflicting something like the D-Day landings, like Operation Overlord, then frankly, having all the space you need to have an aircraft carriers going up and down the channel, or even in the Bay of Biscay, is frankly a lot of effort and a lot of resources. You don't really need to do that. Quizmaster China. Germany had a few seaplane tenders. They were used for recon supply. Not really. I've done a whole video about their tenders and what they got up to. They had some bright ideas about them, but the trouble is they're mostly designed for post-operation, and operating as mail support ships is a very different operational tempo than what you need for naval operations, for this sort of operations. So the thing is, they're designed to turn around 1 or 2 aircraft a day, not 1 or 2 aircraft every other hour, or even more. So there's a trouble, and there's also the amount of supplies and resources they carry, because they're built around that. This is the trouble with taking up ships which are being built for the role in civilian terms. They will be built by a civilian company. And whereas a warship tends to be built with some capacity for wartime surge versus peacetime operations, that costs money. And most civilian companies don't want to do that. No, not really any freshwater seaplane tenders. You didn't seem to need them in that sort of scenario. Bangaroon, questions on the tenders in the Atlantic again. If you've given a breakdown as to what would be a bigger impact on U-boats coordination, surface spotting or condor ring fence? Honestly, the surface spotting is going to be the bigger issue. But that's also going to be a bigger issue on surface ships and all sorts of things. If you've got more Catalinas and you've got or similar aircraft and you've got surface spotting going on, that's going to cause trouble. Because as we talked about before, if you make U-boats dive, you A, strip them of being in radio contact with high command, but also B, stop them being able to go anywhere very fast. There's a reason why U-boats can't really get out the Mediterranean. Because once they're in, the tide is strong enough going in from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean, they can't get out again underwater, because they don't go that fast for that long underwater. So U-boats really are submersible torpedo boats rather than submarines like we would understand them. There's a very big difference between a Type 7 and a Type 22. Sorry. You might have noticed that the poodle was very much going, it's time for my bedtime, and I gave him his ballie to make him happy, and it's made him very, very happy. Good boy. Butt down. I know you want to show your ballie off to me. It's disappeared now. It's disappeared. It is disappeared. There you go. I think I did answer that, but yeah, they would be better as for keeping the submarines down. Condor ring fence, you can't really do that. There aren't really the islands, there aren't really the positions for you to be able to do that in a viable option. But that's good. Also, why use aircraft that are compromised by making them navalized when you can use land-based aircraft against the enemy land-based aircraft? Yeah, that's also an option, but it's one of those things is navalizing aircraft doesn't necessarily compromise them. Float planes probably would, but often naval aircraft, because of the strength that's built into them to do naval operations, especially landing on the decks, can give them some advantages when engaging land-based aircraft. Because they can usually take a punishment. They can usually take a pounding and a half and still keep on doing. Mark Harness had a few more Clemsons survived in the mid-30s. Could the Royal Navy use a few or a couple of the AVD conversions? Probably not, because let's be honest, converting destroyer hulls is always a bit of a nightmare. Let's be honest, look at the Royal Navy's experience with the VNW destroyers. They have plenty of their own to do that conversion with, and they don't do it at all to any of them, because they look at it and go, it's just not sensible. Take care, KVG. A brief stint of time. I think you can probably ask, call the US HAL for that. Yes, a tender for a brief stint of time. I have hidden the ball. We now have a very, very, very intense poodle. A very intense poodle. Do you know where the ball is now? You have looked everywhere. You're sure the ball is there. You're sure. You're sure. Where's the ball? I don't know where the ball is. Have you spotted the ball? Alright, so, yeah, last couple of minutes, last couple of questions. Calm down. Good boy. Good boy. Good boy. And then I will go put someone in the garden and find out why it's not been his bedtime yet. As you can, usually he is nicked about this point after his bedtime, so he has a right to complain. They have messed with the Ralsonian calendar, but you know. Any last questions from Twitch or YouTube before I go? And in answer to what we've got coming up. Firmware Near Leadership next week is Alfredo del Balzan, Marquis de Santa Cruz, the man who could have succeeded with the Spanish Armada. And next week's premiere, there's going to be a live as well, but there's also a premiere, is the pre-World War I Arms Naval Limitation Conference in 1909. Now, that's probably going to be moved to the following Wednesday, but it might be moved to next Friday. But there'll be premieres, and they're mainly done on YouTube. Right. My dog just commented on the bark. Yep, yes, cute, give me back ball. There are many commenting on that one that I should give him back the ball. But no, he's not taking the ball in the garden. And, right, so I'm planning on doing a Twitch stream again tomorrow evening with some computer games, because hopefully I've caught up with all my recording and all the paperwork and admin stuff I fell behind with all the fence falling down, etc. And there'll be brew ships on Sunday, as normal. As normal. I'm not sure who's going to be on the panel. It depends who turns up from the ship-shape crew. And there's also going to be Scuttlebutt 9 coming at some point, but that's going to probably be delayed for a bit because there's there's so many more comments being put in. And yeah, Stronghold Timberborn, who knows what I'll end up playing. Possibly something completely different. Possibly. Depends. I've just received my Patreon money, so I might. It's going to depend on how expensive my Friday morning turns out, because my Friday morning, I'm going to go buy a saw, aren't I? I'm going to go buy a new lovely box saw, which is basically, it has a circular saw on it, but it's all built into a box, and it's got legs and things like it, so I can put it down and make it nice and stable, and so I can cut wood nice and quickly in a very straight line on it. And the thing is, it's like a table saw, but it's got its own. It's not. It's own table. Sort of. So the thing is, that's going to depend on how much money that sets me back, whether or not I decide to purchase something new to have a chat to play on tomorrow evening, or whether I'm playing something old. Oh, it might be red alert free. It depends. Can I deal with Gemma Atherton with the particular acting they have in it? Because the poor actress can actually act, but the lines they give her in red alert free are terrible. Background, final what-if question. If there is a notable increase in ASW aircraft available earlier, does this mean it will change ASW weapon development? More air defense rather than Hedgehog? No. Hedgehog still gets developed because Hedgehog was under development. The process which leading to Hedgehog was well underway in the 1930s. Well underway. The reality is, if more ASW aircraft are in service, though, it's going to have an impact as earlier on, especially on the life expectancy of the earlier submarine crews, and that's going to have a consequential income on the build-up of the submarine force. I've got the CNC bundle on Steam, Alex, so I've got Red Alert Free and all those things. It's just I like to avoid Red Alert Free because whilst it might be all about the memes for Petchington, for me it's all about the, oh my lord, what are they saying now? Oh my lord. I still remember I think it was the one where you defend Brighton, and it's just, oh, it's terrible. It's so terrible. Anyway, take care everyone. Thank you for watching and hope you enjoyed. Doodles and take care. And thank you especially to everyone who's been chatting away and asking questions on Twitch and on YouTube. It's been great to have you. Toodles, thank you. Oh, and as always, I'll be on Discord in a bit to chat away from everyone. So give me about 20 minutes to sort out the fluffy, and I'll be on Discord to answer any more questions people have. Take care.